Hey, happy Saturday, everyone. This is another episode of Welcome to My Bubble. I think this is maybe unprecedented for me as I have two Christians back-to-back weeks. I might even go for three next week. I'm pretty sure Hogtie Champ's not a Christian, and he was my first one a couple weeks ago, first time back. But I'm here with Epydemic2020, who has been a longtime YouTuber, is a philosophy professor teaching intro to philosophy and morality and ethics, and is a Christian. Did I say that already? Did I repeat myself? So welcome.
Good to be here.
We were just talking about how I kind of stumbled over your channel years ago was through the TheoreticalBullshit Treatise on morality, and what did he call you? I think he called you that you were going to be the quarterback for the other team, and the ball was yours, or something like that. But I stumbled over that years ago, and then and I went and pursued your channel just to kind of check out all your content, and kind of went through all that stuff and really enjoyed it, actually. And then after the Noah Adam hangout, he and I got chatting and got closer, and I've kind of come to know him a bit better on Facebook. And and I met you through him on a Facebook group. And I was sitting there looking at the thumbnail. I'm like, man, that guy looks really familiar. But it had been like 7 years or something since, or I guess probably like 3 or 4 years since I had seen your videos. But probably like 7 or 8 years since you had started actually making videos. So it was a thrill to actually, there was a Sam Harris morality discussion that you had brought up some topics. It was off of his Waking Up series. And then recently, I think you commented on on my God Hates Robots video or something. I think we chatted, went back and forth a couple of times on that. And that was kind of interesting as well. So yeah. So let's see. I guess we could start. I'm kind of curious. So you are you still occasionally upload to YouTube.
I wish I would do it a lot more, but yeah, I've been slacking lately. But I still definitely have video ideas. Whenever I find the time to make them, I'll be uploading.
Are you stuck playing Overwatch like Noah Adam? Like
I've avoided it, fortunately.
I keep giving him shit that like he was like threatening me that he was gonna surpass me in subscribers, which I'd have no doubt he could easily do should he fire things up. But I think he's just kind of baiting and taunting me at this point. I wish he'd make more videos. Yeah, you had uploaded. I saw a couple from your class. That was your introduction to philosophy class, or was that your ethics class?
It's a little mix of both. I'll occasionally like prank the students in order to make some sort of philosophical point, and if I think it's going to be funny, I'll go ahead and film it and upload it.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. The other one that I'd seen was your discussion on Plato, where you had an advertisement you played at one point, and it was all about morals and how they derive and what they whether they're from forms or that was kind of an interesting discussion too. How is it? Are they pretty loose about letting you film like that, or?
Yeah, I'll ask them beforehand. If anyone's not cool with the filming, then we just don't do it. Mm-hmm. But I teach enough classes that one group is going to be cool with it.
No, that's cool. So you started making YouTubes when you entered college, it sounds like?
Yep, I think I was like maybe 18 or something. It was pretty early on in college.
Did you and was that how did that, I guess there were a lot of response videos back then.
Yeah, well, really it was more of a personal thing that I kind of made a public thing. I was at that time I was thinking about a lot of questions that I was viewing other people talking about on YouTube, and I thought I don't really have all the answers, but I'd like to throw my hat in the ring and be part of that conversation. So I was hoping to get some really good feedback. At the very beginning, it was very hostile. Like everyone was, YouTube wasn't a very good place for conversation. But eventually, I think once you get going a bit, you start running into people like yourself and like Scott, and you have some good conversations to be had.
Yeah, the that resonates with something because anytime I have a guest, I usually like end up plowing through all their content the week before, and I was going for lunchtime walks, listening to some of your uploads, and and that was true with one of the things you said was I can't remember which context it was or where it was, but you had said something to the effect of that as soon as you say you're a Christian, that there's already, I mean, your point was essentially that you have an uphill battle in terms of being taken sincerely or with any charity as soon as you say you're a Christian from an atheist. Maybe it was the atheist, good atheist video.
Friendly atheist, maybe.
Yeah, friendly atheist. Yeah, and I think it was in the context of that when. That there's so much, it's a little bit like what you're saying. It's like, you came out here making response videos and all of a sudden you just get trounced, right? Like there's very little kind of feeling out of views or soliciting of clarification or whatever. You're just instantly strawmanned and railroaded. And that's an interesting phenomena. Do you, it's so hard. When I'm talking to you, I have like a bunch of topics I want to get to, and I'm trying not to get to them yet because I want to kind of feel this out.
Nice.
Maybe you could talk about, so back then it seemed like you paid not homage, but you gave credit to some of the atheists like Mitch, and I can't remember. There were a couple of times where you listed off some, but it seemed like you were having some positive exchanges and
definitely
having your own views kind of vetted. How did that help with your? I assume you were getting a philosophy undergraduate. Is that true?
I wasn't actually. So I mean, I ultimately did, but I didn't take any philosophy classes until like halfway through my college experience, and it was really the YouTube conversations that drew me towards it, because I was already doing philosophy and studying philosophy without the textbook. So I actually I was actually having a lot of errors because of reading without having the guidance of an actual professor or someone who knows what they're doing.
I know what that's like. It's so hard, I gotta say. But what was your major before that? What did you go in? I assume you're undeclared, but what did you end up kind of thinking?
Yeah, I was going for economics. I actually continued and got my bachelor's in economics.
Oh, really?
And, yeah, ultimately got a master's in philosophy as well. But it was economics to begin with. And I always wanted philosophy, but I was like, oh, it won't pay the bills, so I'll be practical.
There's some weird crossovers between economics and philosophy, I found.
There didn't used to be a distinction. So the early philosophers were just lovers of wisdom, be it economics or be it thinking about God or whatever else. So some of your famous philosophers are actually also famous economists.
Right. Yeah. So you, yeah, it's funny because I think that resonates with people who get involved in the YouTube debate who aren't like Alex Malpass or Ozymandias or these other people who have a background in it. They end up desiring to go back because it's kind of hard playing catch up at this point. So it's good to have people like yourself who are versed and are engaged in the community, even though you're kind of slacking like Noah. I find it helps tremendously. Like Alex did a logic series on Helena Handbasket's video channel, and that was really great. I've tried to have my own hangouts because I'm wanting to learn this stuff, so I'm trying to have these like I'm the person in the room who knows the least, and I try to get all these people who know a lot more than me into the same room, so I can at least get my head wrapped around something a little bit faster. But so that's interesting. So you ended up changing majors, and then but you were how was you? I assume you were a Christian through college?
Yes.
And did you grow up Christian?
I did. So college was really like a time of reevaluation for me. Like I believed stuff as a kid, and then as I got older, I was like, well, my reasoning like sucked as a kid. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I believe as an adult that I was like, either it was insufficient grounds to believe it, or like just that you grew up and you have a better ability to appraise what's true and what's false. So that was a period of re-questioning and going back and reevaluating a lot of past views.
Where were you starting off from? I guess, what is your kind of if it's your I assume, was it part of your family life? Like, did you grow up in a Christian household?
I did. So my family is Southern Baptist. We've always gone to Southern Baptist churches, or at least something very similar to that. So that was my, I guess, theological setting.
And then what was your, those views were, I mean, you kind of went with those views all the way through till you got into college. And then I know I saw in a video you had said that you had, well, you have interviews with street preachers about evolution, where you actually go out and talk to creationists and try to get at what doesn't, what the Bible, what in the Bible doesn't allow for evolution to be the case, right?
Right. Well, I'm willing to talk about all the aspects of it. I just find that when you're talking with a person of who's disbelieves in evolution because they believe in Christianity, I was trying to figure out how that happens. Like, I can understand disagreeing with evolution because you don't understand it, or you think the science goes against it. But with that particular guy, I was wondering, why is it religion led him to disbelieve the main scientific theory?
Yeah, I thought there was two. I don't think, maybe it was for the same person, but.
Well, he had a friend.
Oh, he did? Okay.
Yeah. And I interviewed both.
Yeah, oh, you did. I see. So it was one occasion where you had two people.
Right.
And you had said that you were hoping to do a bit of a series with it.
But unfortunately, no street preachers come around at the college I teach at right now. So I've been hoping if I got a camera ready if they ever do.
Yeah, it is hard to find. I don't know where the street preachers are in Los Angeles. Ironically, I think I know I've seen video footage of Ray Comfort down on the Santa Monica Pier confronting people. But honestly, I think you have to actually go down to the really touristy areas. And because we live in LA, I never go to the touristy areas. So I never see street preachers. But the other really sad thing for me is that I used to love talking to the Mormon missionaries or the Jehovah's Witnesses when they'd come around. And we live at the top of if you were to drop a basketball in my driveway, it would roll 2 miles straight downhill. And so kind of like trick-or-treaters, the Mormons never come up here. So I get to go out on the upside. I get to go out on Halloween, but I don't get any interesting conversations that are other people seeking to discuss it. The interesting thing I thought was, which I'm sure is not I know it's not a uncommon thing, was that one of the guys that you were talking to said something to the effect of that up until the 1920s, it was believed that the atom was the smallest constituent bit of matter, and that when we split the atom bomb, that was when we discovered that there were smaller pieces. And then he said, then Einstein came along, and it was funny to hear his take being very uninformed or uneducated. And I think that's to a large degree a problem. Well, it's a problem with a lot of things, but I think that's a problem with Christians with evolution, don't you think?
Yeah, it's a shame because if you go back in time and look at like what Christianity's become versus what it used to be, your early church fathers and stuff there was no anti-scientific thread back in like Augustine's understanding of Christianity. But for some reason, that's become the norm, is to think of science as an enemy rather than an ally.
Yeah, that was what was really interesting to me, is there was one point where the guy asked if you were Catholic, because apparently he associated the people who believe in evolution that say they're Christian or Catholic, which was really interesting to me, because the Catholic Church does have, even in the 20th century, some credibility with some scientific endeavor, like is it the expansion or the was it the Big Bang? I think was there's a father, maybe a monk, I think, a Franciscan monk, or there's someone who that was key to, maybe somebody in the external chat can remind me. But there was someone who was responsible for or played a key role in the Big Bang discovery. So not Hubble, obviously, but there's I can't remember exactly what it was. I'll keep an eye on it in case somebody says so. But but yeah, so it's interesting that's a real shame that kind of science has fallen out of favor, or felt like maybe it's a threat, I guess, to Christianity. But you don't feel that way. It seems like did you enter college thinking that, or did you hold some of those same positions?
So I used to be a creationist. I used to think evolution was false prior to understanding evolution very well.
It's George Lemaitre. That's right. He was a Jesuit priest. Yes, that's right. Thank you, Simon Funk. I'm sorry, I got distracted by that, and then I completely missed your answer.
Oh, I used to be a creationist. I used to think evolution was false and would eventually be proven false prior to having a robust understanding of evolution.
So how did you, but did you have that allergy, I guess, to mainstream science, or did you not have that? Did you not, were you a little bit more open than that?
So I always thought science and religion should go hand in hand. And I thought that kind of arrogantly that modern scientists had messed up on this one particular question.
But the particular question being evolution,
right?
And how did you come to have your mind persuaded otherwise when you went to college?
I studied evolution on my own tremendously. So really? I wanted to be very certain that if I was going to critique it, that I represented it accurately and that it did not sound like a buffoon, and that I actually knew what I was talking about when I offered these critiques. Because I was noticing, even as a person who thought evolution was false, that everyone else I was listening to on my team critiquing it sounded like an idiot. Like, just the most basic stuff, they weren't able to even understand what it was in order to critique it accurately. They couldn't even define it, but yet they're standing on a pedestal and critiquing it. And I definitely always wanted Christianity to shift away from that type of behavior.
Right. What did you have a moment in your investigation where you realized that you were coming out on the other side of it, thinking otherwise?
I actually had a really weird moment where I went back and I was reading Genesis again, and the only time I'd ever every time I'd read Genesis before, it had been like with the voice of my prior pastors in my head telling me how to take it. And when I read it that other time on my own, I was like, I was missing these blaring inconsistencies with evolution that I was expecting to find. Mm-hmm. So that moment, I think, was actually very influential in just a shocking moment for me to think, wow, maybe that's not actually incompatible.
So when you say that there were, when you went back and you read, was it that you were, I want to make sure I understand this properly. So you're saying that you were that you had imposed a understanding on that seemed to suggest it couldn't comport, and then you were discovering that those things weren't there that you thought were there, or was it, there was something you had just said just then, that when you went back and read scripture, and I'm trying to understand if it's which direction it was going.
I was expecting for a creationist reading of Genesis to be unavoidable. That it would strike me as, wow, this is crazy to even think evolution is possible if these words are true. Mm-hmm. And then as I'm reading it, it's like there are so many things that sound odd from a creationist reading of it. Like 24-hour literal days, except you have plants before you have the sun.
Right.
Or there's a Garden of Eden, which is like means oasis. That's the Hebrew word for it. But the whole world is perfect. Like, why would you have an oasis if everything is like, you only have an oasis in the desert, right?
You wouldn't. Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be an oasis.
Right. So
that's a good point.
As I read back over it, and I'm seeing all these things, I'm like, this is really weird. Like, they get kicked out of the oasis into the proverbial desert. Like, I don't know, there's a lot of it that seemed very strange to me at the time. I think I'm actually probably going to turn that into a video series and pick my words a little bit more carefully.
What, oh man, I had about 3 different ways I want to go, and now I can't remember either of them, any of them. The, so, how, if you don't, this wasn't one of those things, but I can't remember anymore. It's so bad. In terms of the rest of Genesis, then, how do you take it, I guess? So how would you say that at Genesis like 12:1, Abram and Sarah are is the place where it kind of picks up on a bit more of a historical thread, or do you go back further from that? I assume that you don't take a literal understanding of the flood and that there was a reset on all of creation, or do you?
Right. I think there was a huge flood. I don't think there's any reason to think it's a global flood. Including if you just look at like the words that the scripture uses to talk about the flood itself. I think that word starts with an A, and I'm not going to remember the Hebrew off the top of my head for it, but it either means large landmass or like all the land. And I think all the land would be a very dubious interpretation of it.
And do you take it that Noah gathered up some of the local flora and fauna, or do you think? Yeah. However it happened, right. as it happened, and whether you can apprehend or get at that, is that kind of your take on it?
I have no problem thinking there's a guy named Noah who put a bunch of animals on an ark, but I don't think that whatever animals make it on the ark are like that cats come from whatever cats are taken on the ark or something like that.
Right. That there's types and whatnot, and how, and so I assume that then you would think that. Do you think that these things? I'm sorry if I'm going down a line you don't like want to talk about, or not that you don't want to talk about it, but you may not have very strong opinions on these things. But I'm curious, because this actually was the crux for me. Actually, I came to my own. I actually had the same investigation of evolution, and had the same kind of for lack of a better term, crisis of discovering that my going down that path was not leading as I thought it would to the conclusion that I was expecting, and that this was going to have some impact to how I was going to understand things. But do you take it as the early accounts are recorded and faithfully reflect an intention, God's intent in terms of what he intends to communicate through them, but that we wouldn't be able, that they were recorded by men and can't be taken quite as literally as we would think, like with the Tower of Babel and whatnot, that these are things that are written in retrospect from a later ancestor, perhaps like around the time of Abraham, or how do you take it?
Well, it depends on which passage you're talking about in particular. The Bible can be parable, it can be poetry, it can be allegory, or it can be literal narrative history. And I really, just depending on the context of whatever passage you're reading, you pick which one's most likely based on the context there. So for example, like Genesis 1 and 2, there's 2 creation accounts. So whenever you have something described and then described again, using different terms, it's usually a suggestion of poetic recap or something's going on. So I wouldn't try and take the whole thing literally, because it doesn't seem to fit in that instance. Right. And ultimately, even if I mess up on whether it's supposed to be literal or allegorical or poetic or something like that, that's discovering, it's important to get that stuff right. But I think the most important bit is to actually figure out why it's written, what makes the story important, and not necessarily to quibble over were there really this many chariots, or is it literally a super tall tower, or
sure. Like
some of it I think it's important, but it's not crucial.
So does that lead you to have a more flexible understanding of, say, like the 2 accounts of Judas's death? Like, would you just simply see those as two stories that are not would you try to harmonize those, or would you say that we can take those as two different accounts and there's probably some truth in there somewhere?
My inclination would be, those seem like a historical event, so my inclination would be to see if they are able to be harmonized.
Mm-hmm. And what if you came to the conclusion that it couldn't? It wouldn't be any big deal to you in terms of
that would be problematic if you found literal issues with what the Bible's saying is true. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. It has to be an interesting line that you walk in terms of where you make those evaluations of look at this I have to understand it this way, or there's a way I can take this, and then others that are like, for instance, obviously like the sun standing still, right? Like the sun didn't stand still, and that's no problem taking that as conveying an understanding, or I guess it would be the visual phenomena, and not a scientific explanation of what the event was, but have other passages where you don't have that flexibility, and then kind of making those evaluations as you kind of walk along that line. It must be interesting. So,
so just to add one little thing on there, this might be too much detail, but a passage like Luke's gospel is written in a very structured way where he's trying to convey literal history. And if you have an error there where it's literal history, then obviously it's something problematic. Where if it's something like the sun stood still or some miracle that seems odd, I feel like that's a different ball game.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So have you had a lot of do you get a lot of pushback internally to your church? How does your church view this, I guess? How do individuals that you have fellowship with kind of view your views on this? Is it known?
Yes, it's always known. I'm always controversial. I actually love that aspect of church groups, to be able to go in and have these deep kind of conversations. It really depends on the individual and the group you're with. So I tried out oh, go ahead.
The interesting thing is you probably get this type of interrogation, but from the other side.
Yeah.
Going down like the same line of questions, huh?
Right. Well, in the church I'm currently going to, there was two different, they call them life groups. They're little groups you can hang out with people that are like usually your age or similar interest or something. I went to an apologetics group, and I went to a Mere Christianity group. Both kind of like apologetic stuff, figuring I'd get some good conversations out of it. In one group, like all the ideas that I was possessing or expressing were accepted very readily. And it was like, wow, everyone already agrees with me before I'm even talking here. This is the group is very similar to me. And the other group, right when I mentioned something about evolution, was immediately like, not literally, but practically like, oh my gosh, he's a heretic. So very different experiences.
And how did you account for those two different experiences? Was it just who those groups were pulling from, or is this all pulling from the same type of church, or is it different churches, or?
They're all members of the same church there, but that church has somehow managed to amalgamate a bunch of different denominations and individuals with very different views. So I kind of like that about the church I'm currently going to. I'm not sure how they managed it, but that seems to be their climate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Does it ever present issues with sermons that are given or anything like that in terms of how you take these things? Or
I almost never agree fully with whatever pastor is talking, like in any church I've ever gone to. So I've always been very critical when the person's speaking, to be listening out and not just accepting whatever they're saying. So yeah, there's definitely disagreements, but part of what makes it cool is that I'll openly talk about those things after the message is over, and sometimes that's potentially more fruitful than what the message was. Those conversations I really do like.
So you then this will be kind of a good segue into as you then studied philosophy, and you were getting more interested in that. How did you fit some of those things that you would come across that you would find persuasive? It would seem to me like when you started going down that road, that there's an interesting blend between coming with you're probably already going through this through the YouTube content and whatnot, and it seems like you're a pretty um, pretty willing to entertain and evaluate these differing notions. But so you sounds like you've probably been doing that for a while. But as you went into to get your master's, or even just before that, what was that experience like for taking your Christian theology and then having these other works or other types, other big ideas, I guess, and finding ways for those to kind of fit?
So I have two thoughts running through my head here. One is that philosophy classrooms are often portrayed, especially in like Christian movies, as like a place of evil, where you go and your spirituality is at battle with the forces of darkness. And that was not my experience at all, ever. So the philosophy classroom has always been a place where you just are lovers of wisdom and trying to figure out what's true, and has never been an antagonistic source of people out to get me. So I never felt that particular force. And I also never felt what some Christians feel of like overwhelming persuasiveness of these atheistic arguments from David Hume or Nietzsche or some of these other philosophers. I have yet to have one of these guys come in and just say something that's totally devastating, and it hasn't just been interesting topics to think about and explore. I mean, there's been some argument. Most of the time when I'm thinking about arguments that are potentially making me reevaluate some long-held views, it's actually not reading someone else arguing it, but it's just the process of thinking about these things and challenging them and continually putting to the test.
Right, right. Because you have your whole collection that you're coming with, and then when you're trying to, it's probably your own internal investigation that brings those up, right? Not stumbling over like you said, a certain passage or a certain problem.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another thing is coming into it, if you're already interested in philosophy and you're already looking this stuff up ahead of time, and then you come in already with like a set, at least level of understanding, you won't be persuaded by every single thing that you read. Where if you come in with completely nothing, everything sounds persuasive.
Right. How do you go about, well, so you have a lot of things that you're reading that you need to be able to take it on board and really kind of remove those walls, those essentially internally critique it and not have your own biases coming in. I'm sure. I mean, we all kind of face that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's well, anyway, I gotta stay on one thread here. This has been the most, like, I almost thought about canceling this hangout just because it's been a crazy week. And and so I've come in here like literally just like moments before trying to get something done. So I actually have some time this afternoon, and my brain is just like fried. Like it's like Friday. I had a really nice date with my wife last night, but other than that, it's been kind of one thing after another. So I apologize if I'm a little scattered. I'm hoping that I'll like loosen up at some point. But this being able to kind of table your own views and take it on, how is as a Christian and taking I don't know why I think this is any different. I'm gonna bail on my own question here. Anyone coming in is going to have that problem, right? Of like tabling all their presuppositions to actually adhere to it. I think I was going down this line of thinking that like somehow this was more of a problem for you, but it seems like you're maybe we can talk about that in terms of your own commitments being a little more generous or charitable to the other ideas that are out there. Do you think that's the case, that you're a little less rigid in it?
I want to be unbiased, but I don't think it's I don't think anyone ever truly does become completely unbiased. Like, for example, when I teach my students, no matter what position they believe, what tends to happen is, even though we go over all these arguments and I teach them how to argue better, almost nobody changes their mind. They just get better at arguing what they've already believed to begin with. So I think that's a phenomenon that applies to all people here. In order to try and avoid that kind of thing, I actually spend very little time reading Christian apologists and people trying to argue for the same conclusions that I do. And my bookshelf is composed almost entirely of atheistic philosophers and Richard Dawkins material and the classic atheistic stuff. So I don't want to get mired too much into just kind of repeating what other folks are already saying and try and like figure out those conclusions with as little help as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're not there. I think this resonates with a point that Jimmy Stevens and I were talking about last week, was the like he was talking about Christians going out and just trying to find William Lane Craig poning this argument and poning this argument, and you know that those are the things that get the mighty views, and it's not the more stuff that I guess we have to work a little bit more and form your own views and dig at the kind of the hard problems, and just looking for ponage all the time. But it's interesting to me that actually that resonates with me as well. I didn't have a ton of Christian apologetic. Actually, even when I was a Christian, I actually found most of the Christian apologetics to be pretty weak, or pretty uninteresting, or not like it was like the William Lane Craig ponage. Like it was fairly I don't mean to pick on William Lane Craig, but it was fairly straw. It was always fighting a straw man, right? Like if you get a like Josh McDowell book or something like that, or like and I think we talked about Frank Turek last week, or it's so easy to have just a poor representation. So I don't know if that wasn't going towards a question or anything. I
agree with it though.
We had talked about just before we went on air that I was saying that I wanted to chat with you about how you take your when you're teaching now and have to it's along the same lines of having views that you have to leave at the door of the classroom to come in and teach, or and I don't know if that's how it works, but can you talk about your teaching experience a little bit in the context of your Christian faith?
So I don't think it's actually policy that I have to leave my Christian views at the door, or have to take not take a stand, but that is my policy, that I don't take a stand on any of these. My students have no idea what my personal positions are. And essentially, whatever philosopher I'm talking about, I'm that philosopher that day. So if it's Epicurus, then I'm Epicurus, and I'm going to argue for him as well as I can. And if it's time to be David Hume, then I'm going to crush these arguments that other folks are giving, like just embody whichever philosopher we're talking about. So we will give, part of the lecture in 101 is that it talks about arguments for God's existence and talks about arguments against God's existence. And I will fight for one just as well as the other. I think the students probably end up thinking I'm an atheist because I hit very hard when it comes to the critiquing of the apologist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do you think you overcompensate a little bit there, or no?
I mean, I just try and give it as good of a representation as possible. And I think it definitely challenges the students there.
What is your, so along those lines, what do you think is what is the strongest argument for theism? And I'm curious to hear what you think the strongest argument for atheism is.
So it's that's such a weird question to answer in terms of, like, by strongest argument, there's two ways to think of it. Like, one literally rigorously strongest, able to best defend against critique, versus the one most people use to actually become a Christian. Right? So which one are you aiming for there?
Yeah, you're right. Those aren't always the same, because I actually find there's some arguments people find very persuasive for atheism. I think actually the argument from evil, somebody mentioned it last week.
That's the most common, I think.
Yeah, no, I actually don't think that's a very strong argument. Joe Sonseed was on there, and he was curious why I thought that, but I don't find that argument particularly persuasive or strong. And I think it's mainly because I can't argue that. Well, I've never felt like I've been able to argue that in any type of good faith. Like, I think it's a fairly there's tons of baggage in there and assumptions on what is the good, and what I think you can find plenty of reasonable ways to deal with that, and I think Christians generally do, actually. But I guess maybe we'll start with the most rigorous, or the most unassailable.
Fair enough. So as far, apologists in general have always had a certain affinity for deductive arguments. In fact, atheistic philosophers do the same thing. They love to like prove God's existence or prove his non-existence. But in reality, the strongest versions of these arguments are almost always inductive or hunches, not hunches, but just evidence in favor of it. So
yeah,
it's not to say
most plausible or something like that.
right, to argue God's existence is more likely than not, rather than trying to argue, I have proven God's existence and this argument is unassailable.
Right.
So if you actually did want to give the best proofs for God's existence, I think you'd probably be looking at an inductive version of the moral argument or an inductive version of some sort of teleological argument. So somehow arguing that either...
you mean for Christianity or
right.
for theism? Yeah.
Right. Arguing that the existence of moral facts somehow gives us reason to think God's existence is more likely than not, or arguing that the appearance of design, not necessarily like anti-evolution, but just the appearance of here by intention rather than chance, gives us an inclination to think God is real.
What and then what about for atheism?
I think so. The deductive argument, problem of evil, has a ton of baggage, but the inductive version of like a problem of suffering, I think actually has is difficult to answer, and the problem of hiddenness is also pretty tricky. So for like suffering, just to give a super brief intro into it, it's really weird to think that the amount of suffering that exists is here if there is an all-loving, all-powerful deity. That's not to say it's unanswerable, but man, that's a shocking thing to think that people have, like, one of my family members has Alzheimer's. It's a terrible disease, and there's worse out there than that. So why are these gratuitous seeming evils allowed or suffering allowed?
Right.
And that's it's not unanswerable, but it's difficult to understand why.
Yeah, that just seems that one of the omnis is omnibenevolent, or that there is a that's. I guess you would have to assume that that was part of the greatest conceivable being or whatever, that was something that a god would have. Yeah, the what was I going to say? I can't remember. The moral. I want to go down the kind of the moral argument, or talk about because you have a couple of videos on morality, and obviously you teach morality, so seems to be an area of interest to you. How changed are your views from when you did the theoretical bullshit response? Do you watch those and cringe, or?
No, actually, I still have most of those views. I'd say they're more refined now, that they've just gotten better researched. They haven't really changed.
And then, oh my gosh, I'm having such a hard time. In the design argument, I think you have a video on there too, or you mentioned it, I think, in terms of, I think it was in the context of morality. Yeah, it was in context of use, right? It was purpose, and Hume's, I think you have a Hume's
my view has
induction.
entirely changed from that video.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the first time I grappled with the is-ought gap, I thought that I had just, it's immediately solved it, and no, I had not. I was uninformed. I thought that I had a novel solution to it, and in fact, it's no solution at all.
Yeah, let me see if I can recall. The solution was that God created things for a purpose, and if those things have a purpose, therefore, you can derive oughts from them, right? In terms of how they be used, right? So if a pencil is created for a purpose, then you can say that a pencil, you ought to use it a certain way,
right?
But that and did your view change from? I think you then argued that atheism, that there is no teleology or antecedent purpose with the design, and so therefore there's no ought there, right? There's no oughtness.
Right.
Everything essentially would be like a rock, right?
Right. So long story short, I actually do agree that human beings are created by God for a purpose. And that if atheism's true, then human beings are not created for a purpose. We just are. I guess natural selection is the closest thing to a purpose you can get to survive and reproduce. But it's not like if you fail to do the natural thing, you've done wrong. You're just being different. So I agree with that bit, but it just doesn't solve the Izot gap at all. The Izot gap is a very intricate philosophical problem that is not so easily bested.
Yeah, that one and the naturalistic fallacy always trip me up. So Moore's problem, right?
Philosophers conflate them all the time, but they are not the same.
Right, they are not the same. Yeah. But there are always a lot. I guess anytime I go back, where I think that like, okay, could this apply here or whatever, I learned that it's a bit deeper than that, and it's just sticky altogether. It's just tough to work through. Do you not see? So, are you familiar with teleonomy? With use, does that not an antecedent purpose, but that a purpose that falls out of usefulness or suitability for a given thing?
So, for example, I'm actually not familiar with the word, but I think I might have the same concept. Can I try an example and see if this is on the right page?
Sure.
So, scissors are designed to cut things, but they are also useful for the purpose of stabbing people. So, it lends itself nicely to the use of stabbing, even though that wasn't the intended function.
Yeah, I think, well, that would be, I guess that could be a potential, well, that would be a potential, if you happen to find, yeah, so if you happen to find, yeah, I guess it would be a case of teleonomy, but it would be like, for instance, the one that I always use is rocks that pass through a sieve, or so rocks that pass through a sieve are found more suitable for passing through the sieve than the rocks that didn't. And so they weren't designed to pass through the sieve.
Oh, I see. And
so if you imagine the environment as being the sieve without actually any type of knowledge of it, there's a chain of suitability towards the use that, and it's essentially the natural selection reference that you're using, but that's called teleonomy, is when there's no antecedent purpose, but something finds itself conducive towards a given use. And I think that ends up where, for my own views, I'm kind of knee deep in intentionality these days, and realistic view, like realism of different sorts. And I would say that like intentionality is a product of teleonomy, and there's a normative aspect to intentionality, such that when we have, like, for instance, like in terms of speech act theory, or in terms of perception or other, in terms of speech acts or perception or other aspects of intentionality, there's a normative quality that falls out of it, but that it came to be the case because it was more suitable than not towards being the case, essentially. So I think what's interesting is I think that you have we end up with the same problem, which is the is-ought is still a problem for both of those views, right? Like for whether it's from a teleological standpoint or a teleonomical standpoint, but it seems like I think you both have for the teleological view, I think you still have the problem of why is it good to do what God would design you to be that way, or there's still a value you're in a normative value that you're trying to say is objectively the case. So anyway, I'm way beyond what how deep I should get into this. I want to actually do a video on it at some point, and I keep talking about it.
There's one thing to keep in mind that everybody gets wrong about the is-ought gap. The is-ought gap does not say that oughts don't exist. It just says you cannot come to know that oughts exist by observing what is. So, for example, just because you like money doesn't mean that you ought to get it. Or just because you like killing doesn't mean you ought to murder. So merely describing a state of affairs tells you nothing about what you ought to do.
Right, yeah. Let me see. I'm trying to think if I want to open it up quite yet. If I did you have any questions or topics that you wanted to talk about? I've been running my mouth for a while here, but I always tell people I don't intend for this to be an interrogation or an interview. Like I actually want it to be more of a conversation.
Right.
Well, we did have our discussion on God hates robots, but I can't even remember what the discussion was about there. So
yeah, it's evading me right now too. I do remember that video though.
Yeah, I think you talked about how it could be the case that God could set it up in such a way that he gave us made us predisposed to not sin in heaven, having given us the opportunity to be that way from the start, right?
Right.
That God could, it could still be good for God to do something like that, right? But I can't remember what my response was. I liked my response, but I couldn't remember what it was. I think it actually did rope in intentionality or something like that. So I kind of shoehorn that into every problem these days.
Nice.
Yeah, I have a certain view on morality and believe in objective moral facts. So my own belief about it is that that there are certain. So I take an evolutionary account and I say that there's certain biological facts about us. Do you mind me running through this, or
go for it? So far, I have this prediction that we're going to agree on a ton, just based off what you've said so far.
Okay, great. There's an evolutionary account that that I'll assume that I can make an argument for it, but I'm going to have to defer. And since we agree, we can just kind of move on beyond it. But that there are certain biological facts that conduce to biological imperatives for us, right? So in terms of how we sustain ourselves and how our body functions and whatnot. And these could be things thought of in relation to norms in relation to health, right? Like in terms of, I don't want to go down that road. And so basically some of the biological facts concern us conduce to social behaviors and living in groups. And there's a wiring essentially for certain fulfillments of these biological imperatives through these kind of social interactions, and that there's a realm of moral discourse that kind of supervenes on or that emerges from those or supervenes upon those biological imperatives. So there are moral imperatives in relation to our social nature that derive from the biological imperatives. And so I would say a moral fact would be that in a situation between two agents where the consequences of their actions is foreseeable, there is a state of affairs that ought to be the case in order to actualize the moral imperatives which fulfill the biological imperatives. And so there's essentially they're rooted in biological imperatives related to biological facts. But there is that when we talk about a moral fact, that actually what we're talking about is the way I like to think of it in my brain is that there's what is the case and there's what ought to be the case in order to actualize those things, and that those are dynamic. Like as time moves on and the situation changes or whatever, there's kind of this changing states of there are moral facts that essentially derive from what is the case.
Can you give an example of
a moral fact?
Or something about how what is this case tells me what ought to be the case?
Well, it doesn't necessarily tell you. So what I would say that there is I think there are means to have best predictors for what would conduce to this, or what would be the best predictor of what ought to be the case, related to virtues and eudaimonia and kind of a sense of fulfillment. I think there are like different ethical systems that can work towards those goals of informing you as to what you ought to do. So you can have certain virtues that you value, that you find are, and I think Aristotle was onto something with that. And I hunt like mad. I have a book I'm reading right now, but I hunt like mad to try to find books on virtue systems or virtue ethics. But I think that those are tools for knowing what is the case. But it's a little bit like belief forming for empirical facts, right? Like there's no guaranteed way that I'm going to. I have rational faculties and I have means of apprehending what is the case, and forming beliefs about it. But it doesn't guarantee that I have a decision procedure for it that is going to be always successful. Or, but let me try to answer. Can you repeat your question? I'll see if I can.
I was saying, can you show me an example of a biological fact and then the corresponding?
Well, yeah, that's actually, I'm gonna save that for my video. But I'm terrible about pulling these out on the fly.
Can I attempt to do it and see if it's like anywhere close to what you're saying?
Sure. Yeah, you might be better at it than me.
A biological fact is lead is poisonous, and the ought that it produces is you ought not drink water from fountains in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, that would be for, yeah. So like in terms of health, like that would be
It's a fact about your health.
Right. I think it's very similar to health. And I think that's why I find that analogy actually useful. I didn't want to go down that road because everybody goes to that. But I think health, there are certain facts about the way that I think health is an easier solve, like, because it's not relational to anything. It's just that there's a fact about how our organs operate based on their suitability, based on what brought them to be the case in the first place. And that there is there are certain things that are deleterious to my health. We can have an objective conversation about my health. Like I can go to any doctor and I can get pretty good guidance on what I ought to do to be healthy. But there can be disagreement, or there can be different systems that people put out there that don't conduce to that actually are bad, that are based on bad reasoning in respect to it. So I think that would be like different moral systems, essentially, like people taking different stabs at this. You can think of it as like the South Beach diet versus Atkins, right? Like those are kind of analogous to me. And I think religions actually form different, can kind of be seen as that, as like different ways of trying to, I think there's actually, morality is actually something we're trying to refer to, that there is actually a there with respect to this talk. And that the reason why, I hate that objection, right, of like that everybody has, if they're objective moral facts, why do we all have different conclusions about it? Well, that's true for empirical facts as well, right? So,
right. The argument from disagreement is super common and super weak.
Yeah. So I think the hard part for me is deriving let me say this. Actually, what I like about the thing that's actually seemed to hold up with this is that there doesn't become any absolute moral facts in the sense of people thinking of them that like murder is always wrong, or like that it is a relationship between the state of affairs and the agents in it, and those what ought to be the case can exist in a realm of facticity without it actually being an absolute, right? Like it's not that there are these, like Christians tend to talk about moral realism in terms of like absolute, this always applies, right? Universals, essentially.
Nothing drives crazier than hearing Christians give the moral argument and talk about moral absolutes.
Yeah, that was Matt Slick's debate last week or whatever. He continued to just conflate absolutes and objectives the entire time.
Christians do it all the time, and I don't understand it. You can't even, a moral absolute, the second you advocate it, in the next 15 seconds, every time, someone will convey that they truly don't believe it themselves.
Yeah. So the other thing I like about the way this works is that if we were to talk about different dispositions people have, like the person who derives pleasure from something that is heinous, or is wired differently, the biological imperatives, I think, would dictate that they ought not do those things, and it doesn't matter that this predisposes them to happiness or pleasure from derived from those things. So the fulfillment of the biological needs that brought about those biological facts in the first place, the suitability, the teleonomy that I was talking about, that those can be the moral imperatives or the well, see, this is where it's going to be really tricky, and I have to kind of work through this a bit more. But I think the individual wiring that people can have in their, like the different imbalances or other things with respect to how they might gain pleasure from things that are detrimental or deleterious. I think I think the fact that they're based on the biological imperatives, that actually gives an account of how that can be the case, that you can have an ought still, despite somebody not deriving as much pleasure from the next as the next person from it. So, and I think generally these things conduce to a life well lived. Like it is a satisfying life. It's a rich life. And I think actually that has to do with the way we're wired in terms of satisfaction from these things that we partake in, that these behaviors conduce to these feelings. But those can be very different for people based on their chemical makeup or based on other things. I don't think you're guaranteed to be happy from those things, but I think it's generally the case that you are. Like I think it's generally because those conditions that give us pleasure when we do these things co-evolved with the structures that cause them to be the case. So they're kind of self-reinforcing that way.
You got sort of you got like an Aristotle vibe to your moral philosophy.
Yeah.
Like doing the actions we call good ends up benefiting you. The difference, though, Aristotle actually gives a version of the moral argument in his view. So he recognizes that a happy, healthy life requires this thing called virtues. So virtues are good. But he then adds that just because we all value happiness doesn't mean we ought to achieve it. Right. There's your is-ought gap again. Right? Just because we all like it doesn't mean that we ought to do it. His conclusion, a little bit oddly, is because God is good and designed us to be good, that what we like is also good.
Right. Yeah. I think it ends up being like, when properly construed, I think that version of of a moral account from God, that God designed us in such a way that these things, that there's a harmony between the two. I think it actually ends up, I think you can draw the same parallel with a teleonomic account, essentially, of evolution and suitability. And I think what it ends up being, and this, I'm going out on a limb here, but I think my thinking on it is that there is a sense in what it is to be a Homo sapien, right? Like there is a collection of facts about that make those the case. And I've had this conversation with others, but if you were to split off actually Homo sapiens from, if we had a group that went out to Mars and lived there for several, millennia, and had a different biological, like a different evolutionary path, that you would actually have two different, they would actually not have, there'd be moral consideration but not obligation between the groups. That you would actually have essentially what you have right now with chimps and humans. You would actually have a different set of biological facts, and therefore the moral systems would be different between the two.
So there's an example, I think, analogy that might help us out here. So if I was to defend Aristotle's view here, you'd say, imagine a creature like a demon, right? And let's say that they evolved. Right? So there's biological facts about what makes them happy and healthy and flourish.
Did you say a demon?
Demons, yeah.
Okay.
Some kind of nasty creature, right? We get the vibe. Whatever they flourish from is what we call vice.
Right.
All treachery and all these kind of things. That's the set of character traits that they need to embody to live the fully flourishing, happy, healthy life.
Right.
Them flourishing and being happy and healthy might actually be morally evil. So just because it helps them survive and thrive doesn't mean it's good.
Right. It wouldn't be good for us, right?
Or they could be causing harm to all other creatures in the galaxy. Will we
Right, but
still
then I
deem
think
it?
it would. Well, then I would think it would go against their well, the facts that brought them about. Like, that's the hard part, is that the facts that brought them about would have been derived in a environment where they weren't like, they could take out as many creatures as was necessary for those facts to come about, until, like, it's a little like humans actually like exhausting the environment, right? Like,
Well, I mean, you don't have to think of them as exhausting the environment. They could just capture you and torture you and breed you and torture you some more.
right, but those the so the yeah, it's hard to kind of plug Aristotle back into this, into these modern terms. Especially, actually, I'm not terribly familiar with the argument with the were you to have, it would seem to me like that, were you to have these demons that came about such that there is something that you can say that's an ought for how they ought to behave, that in the sense that I'm talking about morality, that the morality would be tied to the relationship between them and the facts that brought that that made that the case. So you have creatures who evolved along a certain line, developed these certain structures, and that they conduce to their to the furtherance of it being the case, and that those behaviors between them would be, if we're talking about the consequences of actions and the what they ought, how they ought act or not act, that there's still a normative sense in terms of that I'd find it doubtful that it would be the case that those things would come about by behaviors which end up battling those biological facts, right? Like, so it seems like demons are construed as being, well, if they were torturing us, that was ingredient to the satisfaction of the satisfaction of their own biological imperatives. So, for instance, if in their society it didn't actually impact their own behavior to each other, like
They don't have
like
to be they don't have to be a society. Like we like to think of other creatures that have morality as like these social creatures because that's what we're used to. But you could literally just have a demon who is out there and enjoys torturing and killing everything else that moves.
If he's a single demon, I would say that he doesn't have a moral there's no moral system there. He wouldn't have any moral obligation to us, and we wouldn't have one to him.
So would it be?
Well, that gets interesting in terms of God, right? I think I just shot myself in the foot because God's would have a different moral. Like that's why that's actually why I think probably that the argument from evil is a bad one. Actually, is that I don't see God's having moral obligations to us necessarily. That it's necessarily the case that they do, but the only if you were to include that in the definition that it did. But in the case of the lone demon, that's the thing, is I think of moral, like I don't think that was there a single human around, I don't think they would have a moral obligation to the rest of primates that are not like themselves. Like I don't think they would all of a sudden have a moral obligation to a chimp. I think morality is a realm of discourse involving human affairs, and that were you to have another species like of aliens or something that had this same type of discourse, that there would be a morality that related to them, but that they wouldn't. We would be potentially targets of moral consideration. Like, for instance, if through abusing us, that it conduced to their own abuse of each other or other dispositions that they might take on as a result of this behavior towards us. And that's a little bit like why I object to killing dogs, like pet dogs or whatever, brutality to dogs, is that it's not that I have a moral obligation to a dog. It's that they're a fact with respect to consideration of human, it's a target of moral consideration, but not of obligation. My obligation is to fellow humans.
I gotcha. You think hurting the dog actually makes you into a worse person who's more likely to hurt people or something along those lines.
Right, yeah, like it conduces to those types, like it's to deleterious aspects of society or other things like that.
Right.
So for the lone demon, I don't think there's a moral realm for the lone
Right.
demon. He would be a target of moral consideration for us, but not obligation. But then like I said, that has implications too. I'd have to think about the consequences to arguments with respect to God. Like that's kind of interesting. So that does bleed into one of my problems with God, is that there's this famous line of what does God, like, I think it's from Star Trek, why does God have need of a starship or something like that? Like when God wants the Enterprise or whatever, Kirk basically realizes, wait, what does God have need of this? And it's a little bit like that. What does God have need of? Moral, like I know why morals exist for humans. I think I have an account for that with respect to evolution, but I don't know what God has that. And I think that actually becomes kind of my argument against God, is that I don't know I know why I have intentionalistic aspects and why I have perceptions and why I perceive states of affairs. And there's an evolutionary account for how these things came to be the case, but I don't know why I would find them in a God. It seems interesting to me that those two things would converge, that we would have all of these aspects through evolutionary account on Earth, that we would come to have these aspects that are shared by this being that is out there, that created this whole state of affairs, and then apparently set everything along a course where we'd eventually develop these same qualities. And that's kind of my view with God in terms of moral considerations. I don't know I don't even understand why God would have intentionalistic aspects. Like, why would he have dispositions towards states of affairs if he was the soul of all existence? He would just simply be. Or
in Christianity, you actually don't have you have a triune entity. So
that's true.
Interestingly, it's never alone.
Yeah.
For example, a non-triune deity would literally be incapable of experiencing love until other creatures existed to give that experience.
What you had said, it seems to apply what you said about the oasis, though, in the desert, right? Like, if God has constantly been in this three-way relationship with himself, which is an interesting way to put it, but being charitable to it. I mean, I want to be charitable to your understanding of the Trinity. Is that when he has this, what would be there would be no desert to the oasis, essentially, right? Like there wouldn't be it would simply be like, why would we have? Oh, that was what your topic was on God Hates Robots. Was you were saying that in order to know love, you might need to know hate, right? Or to know evil to know good, right?
Not quite. So okay, so this might rip us off track, but
it's fine. I think we're. I don't know that we were on a track, but
the argument was essentially this. You asked in your video. You said, why, if you're not sinful in heaven, you must not have free will in heaven. So if you're willing to give up free will, why don't we just not have free will on Earth? Like, how would it fix it? If removing free will is how we get peace in heaven, why don't we just remove free will on Earth?
It was more to the objection that people cite of God wants us to love him freely. So if God is going to remove that ability, and it seemingly can be in an eternal relationship with us not having that ability, why did he need to give us? Why does he despise it at one point and is okay with it later? Or why would he?
Right.
Yeah.
And I floated the idea, maybe free will is necessary for chosen love, but after you've made the choice, you no longer need the capacity, basically the free will, to keep doing evil. If you choose, I don't want to do it anymore, then you can get rid of your capacity to do it. and you don't lose anything, but you still gain you've still chosen your path.
Right, right. And I was saying that I thought that there are dispositions. That's what it was, and this is how I got into intentionality. Was I said that there were dispositions I can have towards things without knowing the counter, right? So like I can, not having ever tasted, like I can have a first taste that I find tasteful and pleasurable simply by virtue of my wiring, that it gives me pleasure to drink my mother's milk, for instance, or something, without having actually tasted something sour or whatever. And so I think I was arguing that you could have an intentionalistic quality that made it such that you never had to actually commit evil to know what it is to freely choose good, that you could always have the disposition to always just, the inclination to always choose good and actually value it, not actually have any value lost by that choice by virtue of the fact that you wouldn't want to do the opposite. So yeah, it's interesting. Do you mind if I throw out the link?
Go for it.
I know I saw Noah hanging around. I don't know if he's still out there, but if people want to make their way in, feel free. And thank you for hanging out with me today. It's interesting. Actually, I was glad we got on that topic. I'd like to talk about that some more. And actually, the thing that terrifies me about making the video on moral realism is that I have this really deep suspicion that when I get done with it, I'm no longer going to think it. Like, I'm just worried I'm going to become a moral nihilist or some other variety of like a pragmatist or something else with respect to morality. Here. Of this. Oh. Hey, Jimmy. Oh, sorry, I thought I got in there. Did you have any questions for me, Aaron, about anything? Or sorry, Epi?
Yeah, could I, no, it's fine if you use the real name. Let me run this idea of morality by you and see what you think about it. If you assume that happiness and your own continued existence is good, then there's several ways that you ought to act in order to achieve that.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
In the same way, if you want to make money, you ought to invest. Well, if you think happiness and your own species existence is good, there's a set of behaviors that you have to engage in order to, there's a set of behaviors that if your happiness is good, there's stuff you have to do in order to be happy. If your species existence is good, then it would be bad to go kill everyone.
Yeah, are you, sorry, is this a question of, is that my view, or is that, are you making a proposal?
I think it, as I understand it, your view is essentially saying because there's biological facts about us, because there's some biological imperatives, that there is a way we ought to behave.
Yeah, I think there's an sorry, I'm trying to show people in the broadcast and it's not letting me. Yeah, because there is it's simply that there are moral facts come from derived from objective facts within the world that relate to our biology, and so it has less to do with happiness directly. Like, I'm hesitant to talk about it in terms of conducing to happiness, or even when I talk about well-being, I'm referring to kind of the wait,
eudaimonia.
Okay. Yeah, like eudaimonia, but in the sense of that, I think that is a consequence of the fulfillment of these imperatives, and so it's not the goal of it. I think it is an indicator for us. Like, I think it's why we do it, but I think that it's kind of like this interlocked. Most of the time, I think it's this interlocked thing where you can derive from the things that make you happy and pleasure and give you pleasure, and make you that give you satisfaction in relating to others can, like for instance, sincerity, right? Like that generally can be something that produces a feeling of satisfaction and happiness because you have sincere interactions and you have a it conduces to like more charitable conversations and truth. There's honesty between two people, and you can trust. And there are these other things that benefits you get from it, and those are things that give you a satisfying life. But I think that that's a like I think you derive pleasure from them, but that's actually just a byproduct of the sorry the underlying that's just a byproduct of the underlying system functioning. And so I think in most people it will conduce to happiness. And I think we can talk in those terms but I think that ultimately what's going on is actually that these things are aligning. God, I'm really happy. You know what? I like cracked open this beer about 10 minutes ago, and it was a horrible decision because I can't have this conversation drinking a Sierra Nevada. So I think that I think happiness is generally a result from it, but I don't know that it's even immediate. Like I think of it more in the long term. Like I think more of it in terms of a little bit like the baseball player who has a great career versus one that had a great season, right? There might be like this might end up being a terrible analogy, but the football player that risks his knee to have a great to win the Super Bowl could end up ruining his career. And so I view it more as the whole of the career is what we're after, not simply winning the one game.
So is this fair summary then? As a biological fact, everybody values eudaimonia. We all want to live happy, flourishing lives where our lives aren't miserable.
Yeah, I think that's generally the case.
All right, so far so good. If you ought to value eudaimonia, if you ought to achieve eudaimonia, then there's certain behaviors that you ought to do as well. Like you ought not be a rapist. If you're aiming for long-term eudaimonia, that's what you should do. You should not become a rapist.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the first premise, but we can move on.
What's the first premise?
Or the in terms of valuing, you ought value eudaimonia.
See, I think that's actually that was the important bit.
Right. No, I know. I'm not trying to cut the legs out from under you. I honestly have to write it down and structure it because it's loosely been hanging in my head, and I've been taking in, I've been on a Searle kick for like the last 6 months. But I have lots of different views with respect to realism. Like there's a whole framework in my head in terms of realism with respect to like direct realism or naive realism with respect to like theories of perception, or with respect to like I really like his accounts of for speech acts and for I find that being ingredient to it's not a moral system or morality, but it's an aspect of our intentionality that involves moral notions or normative qualities that we have, I find intentionality to be normative, and therefore these things that come out of that have way things ought be in order for these things to work essentially, and they came to man, I'm really butchering it. I saw you get a quizzical look on your face, and I want to make sure that I'm clear. So let me back up. So for instance, we have a way of relating to each other, right? In terms of how we how we interact and how we engage. And I think that there's a normative quality with respect to how with respect to how we ought behave towards each other, and how we ought converse and commit speech acts, right? So in terms of like when I'm conveying things to you, there's an expectation of sincerity on your part that I'm representing things accurately, that I'm giving you a true account of things. Generally, there's an expectation of that, except for weird circumstances. And we leverage these expectations to get about through the world and achieve things and live life, right? And to satisfy our biological imperatives, these needs that we have. Sorry, my wife just got home. And so I think that the one aspect of this is what we're talking about when we're talking about morality is the systems of evaluating what we ought do and how we should behave and act towards each other, and that sometimes this conduces to, generally, I think this will conduce to happiness for us. Like we'll get pleasure from it. I think generally it's the best way to get by adhering to these things and by having these fulfilling these oughts, that actually you will end up having a rich, satisfying, full life. Like you'll enjoy yourself, you'll enjoy others. But I think that is a consequence of, like, I think there's obviously I'm a bit of a materialist with respect to those things when it comes to how those things are derived, like how I derive pleasure, or how I that there are underlying facts with respect to how I'm of my makeup that leads those feelings to be the case, that I have these feelings, but the feelings themselves aren't ultimately how that is derived, or how those oughts are derived. Like I don't think you look at a certain situation and figure out what's going to give me the most pleasure from it. I think that it's broader than that. It has to do with creating the type of world you want to live in and having the types of relationships you want to have. That's where I think actually that people get tripped up with morality, is that I think it actually, we can take stances on things because it conduces to the type of world that we can have honest engagements or sincere engagements, or there are certain problems that people will put forward that I think are not problematic because they're not problematic because they conduce to the type of world that we'd want to live in, but not necessarily is immediately satisfactory for that moment. So, man, I'm sorry. It's really, really tough I rarely get in Hangouts and actually like try to actually roll it out. And it's really hard to talk about, especially with half a beer in me. So
we agree about a lot of stuff. I think we're going to agree mostly about how we apply ethics and about long-term benefit for mankind, and that living a life where you have virtues is good. Our conclusions in that respect are going to be very similar, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I actually don't think, I think with God being the deriver of the how your nature is derived, is I think going to line up with and the oughts that fall out of that. Like I think you could take this view on and have a Christian account that looks very similar to this account, actually, that results in kind of objective moral facts in the same way with relation to human nature and the way that we're wired. But it would be that God was the account for that, right?
Can I ask you guys a question about I have so many questions, but can I ask you a question about the topic? You guys have just been discussing the metaethics, and Okay, so it seems to me this question is obviously going to touch on some of Aaron's theology. And by the way, I discovered, it's funny listening to you guys talk about how you ran into each other, because I discovered Epydemic2020 maybe 2 years ago, and I was just, I think it was suggested from, it was one of those suggested channels off of Inspiring Philosophy. So it's good to finally meet you, Aaron. It was good to.
Nice to
This
meet you
is
as well.
like this iconic. Yeah, there's like this iconic figure that's been running. It's kind of like meeting Noah Adam, actually. There's this iconic figure who's been on YouTube for ages, and now it's like meeting a celebrity. So, but my actual question is, and you guys have delved into metaethics more than I have probably, which is why it's good to ask this here. On Christian theism, ground oughts. Can't you just ground obligations and evaluations on the law of God? So it's simple just to say, for example, why ought I to be honest, or why ought I to murder? And the answer is, well, because God creates that moral fact. God creates the moral law, which just is itself the truths which dictate you ought to do this or that. So for example, when God gives commands like thou shalt not murder, implicit or assumed in that command is God is creating the fact, it is true that you ought not murder. Which can you
value something? Let's say I told my son to do something completely random that he didn't understand at all, that didn't actually have any purpose to it. Would he be able to derive value simply from my commanding him to do it?
So personally, I don't think so. But but I think we would assume here, if we're looking at it like a biblical perspective, that human beings are created to interact with God and his commands, right? So the commands wouldn't be just random. They would relate intrinsically to the constitution of human beings and why they're here, their purpose, things like that.
So if I can take a crack at it here, William Lane Craig, philosopher that's come up a bunch of times, a Christian apologist, argues that commands are the source of our moral obligation. And that's one area where I think he's speaking nonsense. So I don't agree at all that a command delivers us the ought. I don't even think it makes sense to say that God creates moral facts. I don't even view them as something which gets created. None of that makes any sense to me. I think the role of God's commands is that God is good. And since he knows what is good, when he gives you a command, it conveys to you what is good. So the reason I'm obligated to follow his commands is not because his command makes up morality, but because his command reflects it.
He's essentially the source for determining what is the good or what you ought to. Like it's an indication or a recommendation, essentially, although it's a command. But
the command is not the source of the good, it is the message. Yeah, the mailman. As Theoretical BS calls it, right? The moral mailman. The command is just the tool to help you figure out what's right and wrong. It does not create your moral obligation. I think even parents do this to some extent. When they say, don't run out into the road, they're not creating morality. They're just informing you of a moral thing that you are currently too ignorant to understand yourself.
Aaron, if you don't mind me asking, where in your view does the obligation piece come from then?
So my view is very similar to moral Platonism. I don't know if that helps any y'all out or not, but essentially Plato argued that there is the good out there, and I think that God's character traits and what the thing, so uncreated aspects of God which are essential to his character, I think that actually is the good, is what Plato calls it. So I think God is good and his commands reflect his own goodness.
Aaron, do you think we have an obligation to obey God's commands?
Yes. And all I mean by that is you ought to be good. Once you tell me that something is good, you're telling me I ought to do it. If his commands are good, then I ought to do them.
You're saying you ought to do them because they have a quality about them that conduces to something that you value, or
It doesn't matter if I value it. So if he says, hey, stop raping people, then I should stop. And it doesn't matter if I personally was the kind of person that really, really enjoyed it or thought it benefited me. Even if it did benefit me in some kind of crazy world, I should stop because it's wrong.
But you just said it's wrong, but that kind of begs
The
it,
word,
right? Like,
the word wrong and the word good means you ought to do it, and the word wrong means you ought not do it.
So you marry normativity, essentially, obligation, to right and wrong. Wrong being ought not, right being ought.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
but
When you prove a moral fact, what you're telling me, this is my metaethical view, the word good means ought to do it. So when you tell me that eudaimonia is good, you're simultaneously telling me that I ought to achieve eudaimonia. And when you tell me rape is bad, you're simultaneously telling me I ought not be a rapist.
you said, so it doesn't have anything to do with value at all. So your values have no indication of what is good.
Well, as Aristotle pointed out, our values do line up with what is good because we were designed in such a way to be good creatures. So he argues, for example, that the way to get eudaimonia is to be virtuous and not to rape people. That if you're a rapist, you're doing it wrong. You're not pursuing eudaimonia in the efficient way. So for his perspective, what we do value and what is good just so happen to correspond with each other because we were designed by a good deity. So the short answer, usually what you value and what is good should line up, but I mean, if you have messed up values or you live a life where you are constantly fostering vice, you might not value what's good, and you should change.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
I'm cool with it.
Okay, so if you, it seems to me like we're almost, it sounds like we're almost in the same camp. If you're
Yeah, it did actually.
yeah, if you're classifying one's obligations as something that's grounded in the good, and the good is found in the character of God, I think, would it be right to say that you would agree with Augustine then? You're just a type of moral conceptualist, and the good is a character quality or a concept in God's mind, which is then just applied to the world? Or is that off?
I'm not sure I followed you the whole way there, but the parts that I was with you on sounded correct.
Okay.
I'm not intimately familiar with Augustine's view on morality. Actually, I mean, I know a little bit about him with thinking evil doesn't exist and whatnot, but I'm not sure I'm following what you're aiming for here.
Just with the Platonism, Augustine basically just takes the forms and puts them in the mind of God, right?
Right. Yes.
So
that I do make that same transition.
Okay. So then it just seems like we're not. The only thing we would disagree about is where we both classify obligations as morally grounded in, or excuse me, ontologically grounded in the good. You're placing the good in God, where I'm placing the good still as kind of like, much like a Platonic form, except the Platonic form is created by God. It's a law that God creates the same time he creates human beings, and which applies to them. And so I guess what my question would be from that is, given these two different models, you have a model where the good is in God, it's a character quality of his, or a concept, or whatever, and on my perspective, it's just a law that God creates, which reflects his nature, but does not exist internally in it. What would be the reason, I know this is off the cuff here, but just prima facie, what would be reasons why you would take the more Augustinian, the more taking the Platonic form of putting it in God over my perspective? Oh, like this is just Reformed scholasticism that I'm.
So your view entails that goodness does not exist until God creates things?
My view would entail that human goodness does not exist until God creates it. So there's a qualitative ontological distinction between God's goodness as it precedes creation and God's goodness as it exists in creation. The one does not depend on the other.
So you are agreeing that there is goodness prior to creation that is not something God makes.
Right. Are you
Yes.
Are you suggesting that there's two potential goods essentially then?
Yeah. Yes. That's fair.
I don't know why you added the second one. That's the only problem I got.
Because creation didn't comport with his nature, so there's a alternative. I too am having trouble understanding what the point would be, I guess, in God creating a new. Can you talk about that a little bit, Jimmy, or maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to hijack the conversation, but just to give a quick overview, someone like myself, I'm a just to catch Aaron up, I'm a Calvinist, so I want to argue that nothing about God prior to creation is included in creation. Creation is so, God is so independent from creation that he's completely incomprehensible to anything in creation unless he voluntarily chooses to reveal himself and participate in creation and take on forms and things that comport to the way he's made creation. So under that sort of to view, I have this agenda where I want to make morality something, I want to make human morality, ethics relating to human beings, not something that is conceptually indispensable to God, because that would seem to deny his independence. Things that have to do with humanity, facts about how humans act, and how things in creation work, things about that would have to be eternally existent in God, rather than things that he actually creates. Which I would argue, I won't argue it here because it just takes forever, but I would argue if you follow that to its logical conclusion, you end up with pantheism, not monotheism.
So can I just clarify? The good tells you then what God, the nature of the universe that God created, not about God. Only in that it could lead you down, like you could potentially have a by virtue of God's nature being different than what he created, and the good being different, then how would you know what God is like if you're accessing it through something that is not akin to God or not of God, that it would be different than he is?
Well, because I would say that, at least on my view, and I open this up to challenge, obviously, but my perspective would be, when God creates this moral law for human beings, he does so in a way to communicate about himself, to reveal himself. So the connection between me and God, the exception to the incomprehensibility rule, as it were, is that God himself reveals who he is through his condescension, through taking on human attributes and coming down and communicating who he is as a man and as the inspirer of things like the Bible. My ability to talk about him and to think true things about God is totally mediated through his revelation, totally mediated through the condescension that he takes.
So with respect to
the simple answer is, well, it's not that I'm just trying to find a mediation of God's nature through anything. It's specifically that I'm trying to find mediation of who God is through what he has said about himself in language that's understandable by human beings.
is this I don't want this to be taken that you're leveraging this in some advantageous way or whatever. That's not what I mean by this, but is this to deal with the issue of, and not that you manufactured it to deal with this issue either. Give me some, take this the right way. Is this to resolve the issue of when God does things we don't understand, or when God does things that seemingly are not good? I don't know how you would decide what, if it is, you're not saying it's arbitrary. You're saying that it was a good he created, or that's even weird to say, but a form of good that was created for our interactions in this nature that is different than his. But it's not arbitrary. It's telling us something about him. But yeah, it's weird. I don't know. Does that make? I don't know if I was.
Yeah, sure.
I thought I was going to
No,
go
no,
somewhere with that, but I guess I'm just going like, yeah, that's weird.
well, I totally admit, like from the outset, there's. It's not like it's not like Reformed scholasticism doesn't have an agenda here. I definitely want, the main goal here is just to stay within the lines of biblical theology, and for philosophy just to be kind of an application of Reformed theology to philosophical language.
Does this not reduce the fact that you could never make a judgment of God's actions as to whether they're good? You'd not know whether it's simply that it's just comporting to this other standard or whatever that's not like God, or isn't a full revelation of him or whatever. That.
Yeah, I guess it would have to. My view would have to say from the outset, right, that God.
You can't judge, essentially.
Well, I wouldn't say that I can't judge, but it might be argued that it's trivially ruled out, that it's just a definitional case where, yeah, I mean, it's just analytically true that God can't do evil, because the evil that we work with is defined in terms of the very law that he arbitrates, and where that comes from is not something that he can change anyway. So
you would take, like for instance, we were talking about the Euthyphro dilemma. You would take that what God commands is the good, right?
Yes.
And that, but then you would say that's not arbitrary, though, right? You would say that's derived from God being good, right? Like,
yeah. So the strange part of that is I would be a necessitarian. So I would say, when God, or excuse me, if God wants to create a world, this is the only one he can create, because it's the only world that reveals who he is. If he changed even the minutest detail, it would be talking about a different God.
But could God be otherwise?
No.
And still be God.
I don't think so.
So God's necessarily the way he is. So
yes.
So you're saying that his commands are derived from his nature, right?
Yes, they're specific. So they're specifically built. This is metaphorical language, obviously, but they're specifically built with the. Well, it's not necessarily. But anyways, they're specifically built with the intent to say something about who he is, to say something about what he's like.
So So it's not that what God commands is good; it's that what is good is what he. Well, it's not what is good is what he commands; it's what he commands is good. Because you had said that he would have to be a certain way, right? So but with both yours and Aaron's view, I still don't understand what the obligation is, where the obligation derives. And I thought actually Ozzy brought up a point that I was curious about as well, is that Aaron had said that eudaimonia was morally good, is morally good. But he said, I thought eudaimonia is what makes things good, not good itself. And that was also, I think, when you were talking about right and wrong, good and talking about eudaimonia, and you said what we ought to do is simply what is defined as good, right?
Yeah, I just argued that when I say something is factually good, I'm saying you ought to do it. And when I'm saying something is factually wrong, I'm telling you, you ought not do it.
But you ought to do it because it's good, though, right? Like, that's what we would say.
If someone answers the question, if I say, why ought I do this? And they say, because it's good, they've not answered anything at all.
Right, but you're saying the good-making property is what we ought to do, right? Like that.
Oh, once we determine that something is good, we've simultaneously realized that we ought to do it. If you can tell me that avoiding suffering is good, then now I already understand morality. I just go around and figure out which actions cause suffering, and I know what's morally good to do. So once you determine something is objectively good.
But why ought you do it though, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
knowing something is morally good. I follow you to that point, but saying that there's this normative component that all rational beings must follow, that I'm still having trouble with. And to be fair, Aaron, I have that same trouble when I talk to atheists who ground it similarly to how you're grounding it. Like those seem like two separate things. I'm sorry, Bert. Like they seem like two different steps or two different conversations. Even if you try to marry them definitionally, to me, they just strike me in the real world as two very different things that require, I would imagine, two very different justifications. Like I could follow you up until, yeah, I mean, it's a good thing that I go help my neighbor across the street. She's an old lady. But am I obligated to do that? Well, that seems like a different question.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Is ought an obligation, or is it?
It would be, yeah. Ought denotes that you have an obligation to do something, right? That's what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. So if I'm going to make morality a little bit more nuanced there, oh, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off there.
No, I guess I was wondering, if we have an ought to do things that are good, does that mean that you're violating that ought by, like eating a sandwich?
Omission.
Yeah.
So I'm oversimplifying a bit to say good means you ought to do it.
How dare you?
In reality, I think there's three positions. There's obligatory, permissible, and forbidden. So there's stuff that you ought to do, there's stuff you ought not do, and then there's a middle ground. So, for example, giving to charity may be something that is just permissible. I could give to charity, or I could spend my time at the soup kitchen instead of my money, or I could do a number of other things. I could that I'm not making the world a dramatically better or worse place. But when it comes to something obviously wrong, like raping someone, then I definitely should not do that. I ought not do it. And when it comes to something, it's easier to say what you ought not to than what you ought to do. It's easier to find the forbiddens than it is the obligatories.
I guess the problem I'm having is that you're saying and I'm sorry if I'm being thick here, that what we I want to make sure I get it right. You're saying that what is good is what we ought to. Is that right? So
yeah.
And then when I ask so how do we know what we ought to do? The answer can't be we ought to do what is good, right? Like there has to be there's a property that makes it what we ought to.
Right. Yeah. The question
and you're saying, and would you say then that is? Would you be like Jimmy? Would you say that's that what God commands is what we ought to do?
What God commands is correlated with what we ought to do. What makes it such that we ought to do it? The way you figure out that you ought to do it is just to figure out what's good. If you can figure out what's good.
you said
I mean, that's the same question, right? Saying what ought we do and saying what is good are the same question. So if you can figure out that there's such a thing as good things, then you can simultaneously figure out what you ought to do.
I think he's asking how we get to the conclusion that something is good in the first place.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fair enough. So earlier, Bert, you blamed it. You said that we are wired a certain way, that we kind of realize these things. And my position is extremely similar to that. I actually appeal to ethical intuitionism, which is this, that sounds fancy. It's just the idea of a conscience. The idea that human beings are hardwired science, right? With knowledge of morality.
So my position, that's a little bit why I was resisting.
Just
is that
Pelagian on us?
Hold on. So the reason why I was resistant to equating it with eudaimonia is that we have pro-social and antisocial behaviors, right? So the morality helps to inform us as to or to give a guide as to when it's an antisocial behavior, right? But we still have these dispositions. So, I mean, you'd agree that we don't always do what's good, right? Or we don't always do. So the intuition fails us, right?
The intuition is not meant to tell us moral conclusions. I think that's something that gets very often misunderstood. And moral intuition's purpose is really twofold. But the main important part is that it lets you know that there's such a thing as good and evil to begin with.
But you had said that the way you determine what you ought to is you adhere, and I don't want to strawman you, but you said that you adhere to a kind of an. Did I hear you say intuitionist or a?
So when I say I'm an ethical intuitionist, it means that I believe there are moral facts because we have. You can blame evolutionary psychology, you can call it moral intuitions, but because we're hardwired in such a way to recognize that there is such a thing. You can call it a moral sense, or there's other cultures have named it differently, but the concept.
So for a given individual, if they're wired differently, what would you say?
We're not wired differently. So evolutionary psychologist Mark Hauser has this quote where he says that human beings are endowed with a universal moral sense that allows us to differentiate right from wrong, but that each culture makes exceptions to this rule. So we all have, like, the principle of unintended harm is in all of our heads. That's something that immediately strikes us. Even if it doesn't tell us what the correct moral conclusion is, that understanding, intuitive appraisal of morality that tells us causing harm on purpose is bad is always in the back of our minds, influencing our decisions. But we have competing intuitions. Like, part of my brain tells me unforeseen harm is bad, and a bigger part of my brain tells me foreseen and intended harm is bad. So that's not going to tell us what we should do with the refugee crisis, or whether or not shooting a cop shooting a black person is worse than us bombing civilians in Iraq. But what it does is it tells us, hey, there's such a thing as right and wrong, that you need to avoid causing this type of harm.
When you say unforeseen harm is bad, you're using a different sense of the word bad there, though, right?
I didn't mean to say unforeseen. I meant to say foreseen harm.
Oh, okay.
Like, for example, you know that if the speed limit stays at 70 miles per hour, a certain number of people are going to get hurt, but we don't tend to care. We know that if you drop bombs on another country, innocent civilians are going to die. And if we kill 2,000 innocent civilians, we knew it was going to happen, but we didn't really mean to. For some reason, we have a lot less outrage than if you kill one person on purpose.
Did you want to say something, Ocean? I cut you off earlier.
No, I think you're chasing it down.
Can
I think I guess one thing, I just made an observation in the side chat, and I want to know if I don't want to strawman Aaron. That it seems like Jimmy is saying in the side chat about God being good grounds human obligation, that whole the ought setup. But how you worded it earlier was that you were saying that good, what God commands correlates with what is good. Does that mean that God did not dictate what is good, and that you're saying that things are good regardless of God, and that it's just a coincidence?
I would say things are good regardless of God's commands. So long as God exists, and God is loving and kind, and he has always existed and can't not exist. So these things are always good at all times, and that his commands really help us figure out what's right when we get confused. So if we start, go ahead.
Outside of God's commands, meaning that what is good is defined by God's nature?
Yes.
Are you saying? Okay.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that?
Go ahead.
So I guess my question is specifically, I'm assuming, Aaron, so correct me if I'm wrong here, you think that, because I was a divine conceptualist, this is the same kind of strategy that I had at one point. And so what I'm curious is, do you think things relating to human ethics, do you think, for example, the obligation I have not to murder people, for example, do you think that is a predicate that is contained in God? So a statement like "thou shalt not murder" is something that's already existent in God's mind or character, or do you think that that's something that's implicatory in God's nature, or would you say something totally different than either of those?
I'm not sure the exact right way to express moral claims, but here's one way of thinking about it. The claim, let me field this one as a virtue theorist. Claims like "thou shalt not murder" is not saying don't think of it as all murder does happen to be wrong, but it's wrong because it makes you have hatred in your heart or makes you dishonest, or some you can express it in terms of character traits. So these character traits are wrong because God as against them. He's loyal and kind and loving and not hateful and deceptive and whatever else. So these things are wrong because they're ungodlike. And it just so happens that murder manifests all the ungodlike vices, which is why it ends up being wrong. So don't think of it as saying an individual action is right or wrong. Think of it as these character traits which God lacks makes us lack godliness, which makes us evil.
So that actually makes it way, I'm so glad you said it, because the virtue ethicist perspective makes it so much easier to frame this question. Is the goodness of God, that, you know, we can attribute that as a property of God's character, is that property the same property as the goodness that Jesus, or I actually should give a better example. Is that the same property that Adam manifested before he fell, or that people will manifest in heaven at the end of time, right? Are those properties ontologically identical?
I'm not even sure how to talk coherently about the ontology of a character trait, but I think ours are always going to be a poor reflection of God, that we are going to embody goodness to a lesser extent, that we're always an imitation.
You can resort to molecules of motion if you want to.
wait, let me ask. Wait, so the question is, do you think that scale? Do you think that is a quantitative difference, or do you think it's a qualitative difference? Like the difference between the goodness that you attribute to me, is that only maximal in God? So it's the same creaturely type of goodness, but only maximally manifested in God, or is it a totally uncreated, totally different kind of goodness, which then I don't see how we would connect to our goodness on the Platonic sort of grounding. Does that question make any sense?
It does. I'm not sure how to answer it, though. My inclination is to say quantity.
Okay, so, but that seems to me to be what drove me away from the divine conceptualism, and that is, I guess, my question. If these differences between man and God are just quantitative, they act on the same scale, then isn't whatever that scale is, isn't whatever that measure or standard of these properties pre-existent to both, something that exists apart from and determines both?
See, there's a problem even in trying to make this comparison. So if I go to virtue theory one more time, and then I'll leave virtue theory alone. Actions are good based upon your particular perspective, like what shoes you fill. The virtuous action for a cop with backup is different than the virtuous action for a woman with a child, right? So courage might look different for those two individuals based upon their own capacities and their own states and their own training and everything else that relates to who makes them who they are. Well, no man is in God's shoes, so no man can be courageous in the same way as God. It's like the virtue is the same, but the way you'd manifest it and it's different. Even though courage is valuable in the cop and in the woman with a child and in God, but they're all going to look very, very different. I don't know if that actually helps out.
It's a bad example. It's a bad example because I'm dying to ask what constitutes courage for God, like what makes something courageous, but it's a complete sidetrack.
You have the all-powerful be courageous. So
yeah, that would be an interesting sidetrack, by the way.
There's a part of I'm running through thought experiments in my head now about the ought being like what you ought do, and then that equating to goodness. And I just ran straight into the problem of evil while thinking about that. Which, I mean, I was going, well, if trying to create a situation which an ought happens, and that would be, well, if you're in a situation in which you can prevent suffering, then you ought do that. Like if you're seeing like a rape or a murder or whatever about to happen, you should there's an ought there to prevent that from taking place. Yet we have a God in all of his wisdom and power that doesn't seem to be interested in stopping things like that happening in our reality. And then problem of evil comes up, and I think it's like a very base segue into it. And not only do we have that situation, but we have, to bring it into more extreme example, the story of Noah, in which God destroys a lot of people, like in effect committing genocide. So I'm like, I don't know. It's like, is God subject to the same moral law that we are? Because the way that you're describing oughts and ought nots to goodness seems to be rooted in God's nature, and yet God has some strange actions under his belt. That's kind of a ramble, but I think you get kind of where I'm going.
That is, in my mind, the strength of these inductive versions of the problem of evil is that we don't know why it is, what reasoning it is that God is not, or we don't know for sure what reasoning it is. We can speculate about why God doesn't stop gratuitous acts of suffering, like rapes from happening, or Alzheimer's from existing, these kind of things. So the inference is, because we don't know, maybe there's no good answer. So I mean, I feel the strength of the problem of evil. I don't ultimately think it persuades when all the arguments are done, but yeah, I think it's a powerful argument in itself.
Yeah, that's why I don't think it's a good argument for atheism.
Wait, that's why you don't think it's a good argument?
You think it's a good argument for atheism? I think
it's a good argument against Christianity. I don't think it's a good argument for atheism. It's a good argument against this concept of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it depends on what your definition of God is. Whether the greatest maximal being includes omnibenevolent, benevolent in the sense that we would mean it, right?
Yeah.
But Aaron, your objection in that, like, maybe there's no way to explain it, seems like, yeah, like that seems like a defeater to this induction, right? Or this saying it's more plausible. I think you can always say, well, why? What firm reason do we have to think that a God couldn't do these things or have good reason to do these things?
I mean, that's what when the theists try and critique the argument, they're going to try and offer plausible reasons why God would allow sadistic acts like rape to occur. I mean, I think
it seems to me like it works the other way around, the other way as well. That's for the atheist that wants to say that God is acting immorally. It's, well, like I hear that all the time, of that God acts as he behaves, and it's kind of like what Jimmy says, is that like God is so other that perhaps we don't understand, or we don't have the full conception of what constitutes a good action by God. Perhaps, there's this long game that he's playing, or
right. So the Christian response, if we go back to that virtue theory analogy, how there's a different morally good action for the cop than there is for the woman with child, based on their circumstances and their ability to understand things. Courage looks different to each individual. You with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
So the argument would simply be this: God's perspective, he has more information than we do. So because of that, the good action for him means not intervening. But from our perspective, the good action means intervening.
Aaron, I think it's William Lane Craig, he goes a step further and even says that so long as it's possible that God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing rape or an act of gratuitous evil, that the atheist can't, that the ground is sort of pulled out from him in terms of making anything like claims to knowledge, or like the force of the inductive argument from evil is kind of null.
Now,
because right?
I would agree if it was a deductive argument that says God cannot have a reason, and you say, well, you don't know that, well, the argument's over, deductive argument is proven. But inductively, I feel the force of the inductive argument. If that was the only argument for or against was we just had, hey, there's gratuitous evil in the world, then it would seem like atheism is more plausible than not. If that's the only piece of evidence we look at in isolation, in my personal view.
Can we go? Hopefully, I'm not treading. I think we, after Jimmy's thing, I don't know that we ever got to talking about what defines the. I guess you had talked about that going back to the good and what we ought to, and determining what it is we ought to, and that we have wait, what was you're a Aristotelian intuitionalist, or what was the?
No, ethical intuitionist.
Ethical intuitionist. That gives you a procedure for determining what we might ought to, right? Like that it gives you something to tune into, or
Let
I
me,
like
let me
that
try an
phrase, by the
example.
way. Might ought. I want to steal that. Might ought.
wait. Let me clarify before you get go down
That's
this
just
line
like a
here.
southernism.
If you
I might ought to
can,
do that.
if you can land us at what describes what derives what we ought to, or how what we ought to is derived. That's what I'm getting at. That's
Okay.
what I'm
I
feeling.
do not derive oughts from anything.
Noah, by the way, Noah, you're like rubbing up against the mic or something like that. You're like humping the mic.
Sorry. Yeah, it's something I do. Sorry.
Physically frustrated.
I'm
you know.
Okay, so the is-ought gap tells you cannot derive an ought from an is. So I will not be able to derive you an ought. But in the words of, I think Michael Huemer is the one that says this, another famous ethical intuitionist. He says, morality, because of your intuitions, some moral claims are self-evident, and you don't need to derive what's already known. So if it's obvious that rape is wrong, then you don't have to derive that you ought not rape from anywhere. It's already obvious to you. It's not like you reason your conclusions to it. You just realize these things. Your conscience, with knowledge, right, has already gave you knowledge of oughts, and it doesn't need to be derived from anywhere.
You're talking about like a system of axioms that just have.
Like when you
It
start
sounds
to
like you're
see- when you
describing
start-
axioms.
Right, well, I'm trying to think exactly how you mean this word to be. Statements that are true, axioms.
It's like, yeah, just like trivially true. I don't know
things that
if
we
you would assume an axiom, but you might.
right. Well, it's not
But
things that you
it's
assume.
assumed out of the appearance,
It's,
the
yeah,
apparent
yeah.
trueness of it.
Right. So like things that are prima facie justified, seemingly self-evident stuff.
Right.
It seems self-evident that causing harm to other people is bad. Now we can get nuanced as to which particular actions constitute causing harm, like is it wrong to burn witches, that kind of stuff. But moral intuitions don't solve those questions for you. They don't answer questions like do witches exist and is it wrong to burn them. They just tell you the basics like harm is bad or helping the world flourish is good. And once you realize that anything is objectively good or evil, you've already landed in objective morality.
I think the justification for burning witches.
What's that?
Witches. But
Well, yeah,
Oh,
misused as justification, possibly.
well, no, I think that the justification might be that witches cause harm, and that by burning them, you're getting
Right,
rid
but they
of
don't really
the harm.
exist. So people, witches aren't
I mean, I
real,
know
so
a few,
people
so
will burn them on accident. I mean, that's how we justify immoral actions. Our intuitions and misinformation about science lead us to do things and disagree about morality. But the intuitions all give us the same kind of appraisal that there is such a thing as morality, but it doesn't tell us those answers to moral dilemmas.
Dash, you had a question.
Yes. What I'm missing is, I think I can't say that harm is bad, but if I try to understand why harm is bad, I want to understand why it's bad, at least to me. Meaning, what is the goal I try to achieve that make it harm, that make it bad? What is the good itself, or what is the goal I try to achieve here?
What gives it value, essentially, right?
Yes, I mean, the best, I'm myself thinking about it still, but the answer that I think that I found at least convincing to me was that I try to be in self-sufficient with myself, and in order to do that, I need to live next to another. I live next to another people, so if I harm other people, I create environment of distrust, and because of that, harm me being able to complete myself, it's a move of possibilities that I can do. It's make my environment itself unsafe and so on. That's the best answer I could get at myself. But I mean, it's still I still don't have. But I think that ultimately I still have the same problem that I don't have a justification on why to be what I would call self-sufficient is here. I mean, I think it's the same for me. I mean, what is the goal here? What is you call value? I mean, yes. What is if it value is the word? Then yes. What is the value in the end, that in the end that we say that it's good or bad? What we try to achieve here?
So, I like your perspective there. Interestingly, Aristotle says that the goal is to be self-perfection, and you call it self-sufficient. Y'all sound really similar in my mind. But I think ultimately we're going to keep kicking the can here until we get closer and closer to the foundation of morality. And where I think is the place most people stop is something like eudaimonia or something like the well-being of society. But you can describe almost all good actions in terms of one of those things. Like rape is wrong because it harms society. Murder is wrong because it harms society. Or murder is wrong because it reduces eudaimonia. Or rape is wrong because it reduces eudaimonia. Right? That can be our answers to say, well, the reason that rape is bad is because eudaimonia is good. The reason that murder is bad is because benefiting society is good. But then we just ask the question one more time.
Right,
well, why is eudaimonia good? Why is flourishing of society good? And that, I think that can keeps getting kicked, and either you just assume that it's good and don't try and answer the question, but if you probe the question long enough, I think that's where the moral argument comes in, and you end up saying, well, eudaimonia is good and flourishing is good, both because that God is good, and yeah, long story short.
I myself would ground it more in. I don't think that it necessarily would ground it in God. It's more Platonic, understanding from what I recall, that that's some dualism to some degree, but that when we think about good, there is something in the human intrinsic that the soul is perfect beforehand, and now we recall it, meaning that we had a perfect understanding beforehand, and now we just try to recall it back, sort of thing.
It seems really unsatisfactory to me to say.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dash. You can go ahead and fish. I'm sorry.
I don't think it's satisfactory to me. Not fully. I mean, it's just saying that. But I mean, if I would say God created the pool of, or the soul himself, or something like that, it's get to the problem there. Essentially, if you add salt to the mix, you get other issues that I'm not entirely sure how to solve myself. But I mean, but we come from, but to say that we do come from some perfect state before and as human, what I think it's what Aaron called intuition to some degree, that we come from some basic knowledge on the basic questions, and we can ask, and we perhaps not be aware of the basic question, but we can ask, but we can become aware of them, and the questions themselves don't change over time. But the answers to them might change, but the basic questions wouldn't change regarding the good life.
When I was saying, sorry.
I think that would be a better grounding of why it is eternal. The question, because the question don't change. Sorry, continue.
When I said that it was unsatisfactory, I didn't mean your point there. I meant when Aaron said that you can continue to ask the question until you just have to assume it. It seems to me like like when people ask me what defines the good or what constitutes the good, I think that I have some account for that related to objective facts regarding the way that I'm construed, the foreseeable consequence of my actions with respect to another agent, and there's a set of facts that this sits upon. And so what is good is what actualizes those that next state of affairs that fulfills the reasons that brought these facts to be the case, that there's something that it is to be a human or Homo sapien, or however you want to put it, or the type of species that I am. And there's a objective there's an objective facticity to how that came to be the case, and that so there's a normative quality in the way that I am, right? Like there's something I can derive from a set of facts, what would continue those facts to be. I don't want to go down to the realm of, like, I don't want to go down the road of like saying that survival of the fittest or anything like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that there are facts about me that came to be the case through the process of evolution, such that my perception, right, like my perception is working correctly when I perceive states of affairs, when it's the case that I actually perceive what is the case. Like I look out on the world, my eyes see my cup of beer, and there's a conditions of satisfaction for whether I'm actually perceiving this or not. So there's a normative quality with respect to my perception that when I'm not such that you can say when I'm not perceiving the beer in front of me, and that perception came about by virtue of its conduciveness to perceiving states of affairs, right? Like there's a story for why that is the case, right? Like there's an account for why that came to be the case. So it seems to me like there's a grounding there somewhere that I need to flesh out better in terms of how I can speak to what I ought do next. Like there is a good there that that relates to facts in the world, but it seems to me like the ethical intuitionism that you're reflecting, that seems to me like a procedure for determining what is the good, or a way to, but it doesn't tell me what the good is, right? And I think that's it comes down to what I ought do, and what I ought do is that which leads to eudaimonia. But eudaimonia is simply a condition of satisfaction, or rich, or fulfillment, or a wholeness, or a however you want to, a fullness, or however you want to put it forward, that in terms of how it's what we mean by that. But that seems to me the result of doing the good, not the good itself, right? Like it doesn't inform what I ought do. It tells me of what may occur should I pursue this, right? So I'm still kind of that's why I was saying it's unsatisfactory then to say that, well, we can continue to ask this question until we have to assume what defines the good, or what constitutes or makes something, what's a good making property. Yeah.
So I have a prediction, and then I have an idea. So one thing, when we're trying to figure out what constitutes the good, that's an interesting venture, that's a worthwhile venture, but it's not a super relevant venture to determining there's such a thing as good. So the first thing I concern myself with is there such a thing as good? And I think our intuitions make the case, yes, there are good and bad behaviors. And then we can use our reason to debate until the sun's blue to figure out what are examples of good behavior. It's a worthwhile thing to figure out what is 100% good. But we don't need to figure out what the good is in order to know there's such a thing as goodness. Did that little distinction make sense?
Yeah, I think by virtue of the fact that we value, right? To say that I value something is to say that there's a scale there, right, between good and bad.
I was going to ask that, if I could tack on to what Bert is saying, how value fits into this for you, Aaron.
I would not say that just because we value something means something's objectively good. That's like saying just because it's subjective.
I didn't say that it was. I didn't mean to say that it was objectively good because of that. I was saying that it tells us that there's a thing such as good or bad. It doesn't tell us the nature of it or anything like that. But it's meaningful to speak that way, right? Like it denotes, it indicates that there's a meaningful way to refer to good and bad, right? Like we know what we're talking about. We're referring to valuing something, right? When we say that we say we ought do something, we're saying you ought value it, or you ought, you have an obligation to it, or right.
Right, you ought to value it. So I think that's what your conscience does. It tells you, you ought to value not causing harm on purpose. It tells us there are objective morals, even if it doesn't tell us like what makes it wrong. It tells us there is something wrong.
But I think you need to root that in, like, if you were to talk that way, you need to say that you ought not harm people, like you ought value not harming people. But you can, again, you can ask the question, why ought I not?
Right, and that's it's a worthwhile question to ask, but you don't need to have your solution to normative ethics in order to figure out there's such a thing as normative ethics. Right? You don't have to have the philosophy. In fact, most people are going around saying things are right and wrong, and they have no idea what their own standard or framework or preference is. So they don't know what makes it wrong, but they have the intuition to be able to realize there is such a thing as right and wrong. Right,
but we have, that's somewhat trivial, right? Like we have disagreements though, right? Like that's why we're talking about what is the good making properties. That sure, like if people, like my kids, like, or all of us, right, as infants or as toddlers, developed a sense of right and wrong, and a sense of valuing that, or a system of values that informed us as to how we ought to behave or whatnot. And that I think is the easy part. I didn't even know that was, like, I think that's pretty obvious. But but then when we have disagreement and we need to talk about what it is we're referring to, like when we're saying something good, what are we saying about it, right? Like that's I would say that's not only a meaningful question, it's a critical question to resolving social interactions and talking about behavior as a normative, in a normative way, like saying that you ought, like I'm saying that you ought do it, right? Like I'm not just trying to dictate my own conditions, but
right. What I'm hinting at here is, oh, go ahead.
No.
Let me say this one thing. Go ahead, jump in after this. So one person says, I think that life is good. I'm pro-life. I value life. Another person says, oh, well, I'm pro-choice. I value choice. I think we can disagree about the moral conclusion, which one trumps the other, but it's intuitively obvious that life and choice are both good things. So even though I haven't figured out the moral framework of how to actually solve this moral dilemma yet, before we even get there, none of that disagreement undermines that there's such a thing as good and evil in the first place. And that's a stumbling block for a heck of a lot of people, is they deny the existence of objective good and evil and often use disagreement as a reason to do it. And I think people often expect that our moral intuitions are going to give us moral conclusions, which is another assumption that messes people up when it comes to morality.
But the hard part is, what we want to say is we want to say one of those two is mistaken, right?
One of the people's mistaken?
No, that the in terms of like they can't. We want to say that there's well, unless you're a moral relativist or a moral nihilist, which you wouldn't be having a conversation to begin with. But you want to be able to say that, like, if I were to say that you were mistaken in your views on abortion or whatever, like I don't necessarily want to open up Pandora's box on that topic. But when I want to make recommendations to you, right, like I need to have a reason for doing it, such that I could say that if I'm going to believe that there's an objective factness about it, I want to be able to say that I should be able to say that you are mistaken, right, in your intuition for that given.
Your intuition isn't mistaken. Your intuition doesn't offer you.
Yeah, that was a bad term. I simply meant your decision is mistaken, or you ought not value it, right?
Right. So just to bring in one extra term here, there's another famous ethical intuitionist, W.D. Ross. He talks about value pluralism. And essentially his argument is this: the intuitions tell you what's valuable. They don't tell you which value, how they're ranked. So when life and choice conflict with each other, your conscience doesn't tell you whether pro-life or pro-choice is the correct answer. Now, there is a right answer to be had, but don't expect us to agree on it because it's not intuitively obvious. It's self-evident life is valuable. It's self-evident that choice is valuable. It is not self-evident what happens when I can't have my cake and eat it too.
Right.
Can
Can I do one more thing, Jimmy? Is that all right? I'm sorry. I know.
Please do. Yeah.
Okay. We can analogize this to beliefs and states of affairs and empirical beliefs, right? Like we can say that we're going to differ. We're going to disagree on what is the case in a lot of respects. We've done it plenty today, right, in our conversation, with respect to things that we are reasoning about, right? But that we simply agree that there's a state of affairs that we're referring to doesn't really help us much. Like that there is oughtness, or that there is normativity. We can agree on that. It doesn't really get us that far. And certainly we can disagree about empirical facts, and we can get along. Like I can go to work tomorrow and I have a high degree of success in a number of them. But where we hit a situation where something matters, right? Like where we're trying to come to an agreement for the sake of, we feel it's important to persuade each other of something, we might bring into question the procedures by which they go about it, by which they go about reasoning about the world, or maybe they apply skepticism, or maybe they apply some other system of reasoning about the world so as to apprehend it. But what we're really interested in first and foremost is there a there to refer to? Like, is there something we can agree on objectively? And what do we mean by that? Like, what do we mean by saying that my beer is right here, and we can both agree that my beer is right here? And I think that's similar for moral facts, is that like, if we're going to have a conversation about objective qualities, we need to know what makes it an objective moral fact, or or what makes it good, or what makes it something we ought to do. We can disagree about a lot of them, but if we're having a conversation about what constitutes it, then I think it is important to actually dig into that. Sorry, I think I might have gone off track at the very end there.
If I could just ask a follow-up, and I think it's basically the same thing. I'm really interested how this relates to like Plantinga's reformed epistemology and Reidian common sense realism and those sorts of things. And the question is the same that has already been asked 1,000 times by yeah, but it's been asked 1,000 times by Calvinist philosophers throughout the ages to people who agree with this type of Reidian epistemology. But I guess my question is, what sort of common ground can you have with other people in an argument or conversation or persuasion if you are intuitionally, categorically disagreeing, right? So like, if I were an atheist, I would just be a Schopenhauerian. I would say, good is a nice word for small moments of peace outside a world that is basically painful and meaningless, dictated by an evil will. It's just a will to exist. That's the kind of atheist that I would be if I were an atheist. And I wouldn't have any intuitional common ground with you. I would just say, no, I intuit that everything you think intuitively about morality is wrong. At that point, how can you have any I guess for me as a Christian, what I would be interested in is how do you have an apologetic discourse with this person? How do you try to be an evangelist to that kind of person if your common ground is going to be grounded in the very intuitions which bar you from any kind of appeal? Or it seems to me anyways.
I do not think that we have different moral intuitions than any other person. Each person has the same set of intuitions. I have this quote, I found this paper, here we go. Quote from Mark Hauser right now, an atheistic evolutionary psychologist. He says, the moral faculty is equipped with a universal set of rules, with each culture setting up particular exceptions to these rules. Right? Darwin himself says that the main difference between man and the lower animals is the moral sense or conscience, summed up in the short and imperious word ought. So the point being here is that moral intuitions exist. They're universal. We all have them. They give us reason to believe that oughts exist. The difference between the atheist that you're describing and a person like myself is Not that they don't have moral intuitions, but that they think the moral intuitions are an illusion. They don't trust their conscience is telling them something real about the world, where I think that the conscience does tell us, does make the existence of morality self-evident. So the difference there is it rational to trust your conscience, or should we discount the conscience? That's the particular disagreement I think I'd have with that individual.
But can I be a stickler real quick? Just, and then I'll take off because I'm taking over too much of the conversation. But
no, you're fine, Jimmy. You're fine. Just stick around.
What if the Schopenhauerian just says, well, no, I don't even believe there's illusion in morality. And in fact, my belief in that is so strong that it's an intuition. I intuit from the get-go that the real illusion is that there's any conscience at all. That there's anything to have an illusion about in the first place.
Then they've made a scientific claim that is easily disprovable, right? Voltaire told us that when it's nature versus nurture, that we're a blank slate, and nurture is everything there is. I think he said something along the lines of, mankind does not come with moral prescriptions, but comes with the capacity of learning them. Something along those lines. Basically, he's saying nurture is all that matters. There is no natural aspect. There is no conscience. But the idea there is no conscience is literally an absurd notion if you're familiar with evolutionary psychology. Independent cultures have come up with the term conscience, with a moral sense. They called it Taboa in Africa. They called it Ren in China. Socrates talks about it, calls it an inner daemon. It's a universally attested to experience, and you can use evolutionary psychology not only to say that people have it, but to demonstrate that they have it, to show that people are capable of navigating social and moral norms at the earliest of ages, and to even identify individual intuitions that they have. So to just deny that conscience is a real thing is to take, I think, a scientifically untenable approach.
I think. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jimmy.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sure I understand here. So the common ground between you and the Schopenhauerian is in scientific investigation, not in intuitions.
I would say, like it or not, we both have these same intuitions, and the difference is that you're discounting them and I'm accepting them.
And the way you would argue that is by appeal to scientific methodology, right?
I would just point to an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence that the conscience is a real thing, a product of nature and not nurture.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that.
I think I would. Okay, so
Go ahead, Dash.
I think I would ground the basic in the questions themselves. Humans, I would assume, I assume that humans are built in some basic structure the same, and because of that, the questions they will ask on how they will be better themselves are the same question. Are the same questions they will ask that every human will ask. Also, the fact that humans live next to each other is not something that you can doubt in that sense, because humans do live next to each other. Even if someone living in an island, lone island, he just ignorant to other people, but he live in world with other people, nonetheless, or in universe with other people, if we take it to planets. So the fact that there is the certain separation that this is his house, this is my house, exists when I navigate in the world. And it creates a certain amount of questions that some of them are basic and not change by specific context or certain personality. How we answer the question might differ, and we might be wrong or less correct when we navigate in the questions, but the ground itself is that we have the same question between all of us. That the moral, or at least the moral question are the same between all of us, the basic ones.
I agree with you with the whole no man's island thing. We're all very similar. We have empathy, we have mirror neurons, we have a trust chemical called oxytocin coursing through our brains. We come equipped, we're very good at deontic reasoning, or reasoning about what's permissible and what's not permissible, just by virtue of being a social species. So there's a lot of of pressure to live in a group here. And I think part of that is that we end up developing intuitions and understandings about morality that link us together.
Yeah, I was gonna go off of that do discussion about I feel like I always screwed up in terms of common intuition between individuals, and that one is denying or not paying heed, right, to an intuition that they ought be having, right? Like you're saying that there's a conscience there, that there's something indicating to them what they should do, and they are not heeding it, right? Is that fair, Aaron?
Or acknowledge.
Can I add just a little hint of insight on the conscience here, how I think about it? I think it might help out.
Sure.
Conscience is basically a heuristic, like not an algorithm. It's a guess. It's a programmed way of looking at the world, like a reminder, a mental reminder. So, for example, if you're gonna engage in sex with your sister, it would make sense to have some sort of intuition that's like, hey, wait a minute, right? Like that's going to lead to birth defects. There's some incentive not to do this. So you could very easily, even evolutionarily speaking, you could develop this inclination that tells you, well, hesitate there, right? Think about that more. Or if you're going to kill your neighbor and you live in a small tribe, there's an evolutionary incentive to be like, hey, killing your neighbor, you should stop and think about that. So I think what ends up happening is that moral intuitions will let you know, like, deceiving people is wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that it's actually wrong to deceive people in that scenario, that that's the moral conclusion you should reach. But what it does is it lets you know deceiving people in general is wrong. And then you're going to use your intuition. It's going to probably influence you a little bit in how you navigate thinking about right and wrong. So it's just these, like, it doesn't tell you the moral conclusion. It doesn't say deception is wrong in this case. It just makes you stop and say, hey, deception's usually wrong. Think about this some more.
It's like a pop-up reminder.
Yeah, it's that paperclip.
Like pop-up video. Why couldn't you just then say, because it seems like what you're saying is that we're wired. We have I mean, you're referring to evolutionary biology, and that we have a way about us that that can be shown, or that is warrants belief that there's this nature to us, essentially, like this that results in a consciousness, right? And that the consciousness then seems to, or your conscience, I should say, your conscience will inform you as to what you ought to do. It'll give you okay, you didn't like that. I see a little handshake.
It nudges you. It lets you know there's such a thing as right and wrong, and prompts you to think about deeper. Okay,
so it's a let's say like a early warning system, or like some type of it's like some type of something that signals you that, hey,
moral
this
dilemma
is
approaching, right?
Almost like a divining rod or something, like if you're heading towards water or not, right? But it doesn't tell you what you're headed towards. Like it doesn't. It seems like there's still a good behind that, or that simply the means by which we ascertain what is good or what we ought to do, but it still doesn't inform me as to what that is. But it would seem like you're putting that beyond the reach of us. Would that be accurate to say that we couldn't speculate as to what?
No, we can figure it out. We actually can we can figure out what's right and wrong. It's at least theoretically possible. Right?
But you're talking about, when you say that, you're saying that we can figure out what is the right thing to do in a given situation.
But not by our conscience. Your conscience does not solve the moral dilemmas. Now, moral dilemmas can be solved, just not by your conscience alone.
Sure. So is there a common property to these behaviors which make them the case that we ought to do them? Like you're saying that for any given situation, we can ascertain what is the thing we ought to, or what is the good thing to do, right?
Potentially we can figure it out.
Right. In theory, we can figure it out, but there is a good thing there, right? Like whether we can figure it out or not, there is a sense in which there is something that is the right thing to do, or something we ought to.
Every moral dilemma has two competing goods, and you're trying to determine which one's better. If it's not a moral dilemma, then the morally right option becomes obvious.
Right. Okay. So we have a moral dilemma. We have two options, and regardless of whether we can know it's the case or not, there is a objective fact with relation to what the right thing to do is, or what we ought to do.
Yes, given a very specific set of circumstances, there is a morally right answer to be had. Right.
We could, well, regardless of whether there's a specific set of circumstances, right? Like every moral dilemma has a right course, right?
Yes.
And a wrong course.
It's
but
always
even if one is more right, or there is a right course, right?
Yes.
So like Sam Harris has the moral landscape, where there are different ways that you can kind of get to different points, but there's still one tallest peak, right?
Right. I agree with Sam Harris completely on the whole permissible versus obligatory distinction there.
Mm-hmm. So that there is a highest peak, essentially, that were we to know what that peak was, we could reach it. Is there any common property between peaks that make them the highest peak?
Yeah, I think Sam Harris when he gives his explanation of morality, I think it's a very good one. The well-being of conscious creatures is...
In terms of the greatest maximal suffering, and that we're
right
on the other end of the spectrum? I
think like 99% of the time, his moral conclusion ends up being the right one. That he's picked a very good moral philosophy in terms of his moral action is extremely highly correlated with what's actually the morally right action.
What's interesting is that it seemed like you could... It seemed like you could... The irony is that when you and Jimmy talk, it sounds like you guys are agreeing on a different framework. When I talk with you, like, I'm going, oh wow, you could almost, like, essentially it seems like we're both ending at our biology, and you're going kind of one step further, right? Like, would you say that's the case? Do you think that's accurate?
That's exactly what I wanted to ask. That's exactly what I wanted to ask.
So earlier I wanted to make a prediction, and I think it's about to come true. So if I could back up one step.
Oh boy.
I think, so the reason I disagree with Harris, so Sam Harris says there are facts about human nature.
I love that. Ham Saris. I think that's a new South Park character.
Yeah, that is now his name. So Ham Saris talks about facts about human flourishing. And he says there are, in fact, biological facts about what makes you flourish, and then starts deriving morality out of that, right? If something fails to lead to human flourishing, it's bad. And if it does lead to human flourishing, it is good. And all he has to do to get there is start with the assumption that human flourishing is, in fact, good. If you assume human flourishing is good, then rape is bad. And giving children clean water is good, because that leads to human flourishing. So all you have to do is make the assumption that goodness exists, and that he's got the right definition of it, and his moral philosophy works. I think almost all of the secular accounts of morality end up potentially being the same as any account of morality I can come up with. The difference is whether or not naturalism has some way of proving the assumption I believe to be true. When someone assumes that flourishing is good, I think they're right, but I don't think that they have the means to demonstrate that they're right.
Here's how I see that. Is I see that well-being provides that Sam Harris has a useful predictor there in what is the moral choice, and has like, when you consider well-being, of all, like you could take on the veil of ignorance example, right? Of like that's another, I don't want to offer that, but I think you know what I'm talking about in terms of like, if you had to evaluate it being nothing, being just with consideration of everyone's well-being, the maximal well-being for everyone, or for the greatest, that you would land on the good more often than not. And it's not surprising to me that eudaimonia or well-being correlates to good acts, but it still doesn't like I think that and I think I think Sam Harris might, just assuming that he as an atheist probably holds a similar view, in that the reason for that, the reason why well-being and flourishing and the feeling of a full life, of a life that you can reflect on and say was well lived, that those things, that satisfaction all derives from a set of biological facts that this kind of tier of supervenience that I talk about, but that eudaimonia, or the well-being, is the consequence of that. It is not what I think it's wrong to start with, that well-being equates the good, or I don't know. It seems to me like you're pointing at the indicators and not but not what it is about a given action that makes it good. I think it still kind of references oh, sorry, go ahead.
I agree with you. So the naturalistic fallacy is essentially correlation does not equal causation, and that's what we have here. You can point towards human flourishing and even notice that it's 100% correlated with good. Maybe every instance that increases human flourishing is also the morally good choice. You've at no point proven human flourishing is the cause of goodness, right? Or causes the thing to be good. It's just an example of goodness.
Well, it's not. Eudaimonia or well-being isn't an example of goodness. It's the result of goodness, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So wait, let me see if I'm just following. So, Bert, you're asking if eudaimonia realized is goodness versus eudaimonia as a norm or as a concept.
Eudaimonia doesn't constitute the good. It is the effect of the good. It is the effect of it that I have a life well lived, but it doesn't tell me what the good is, right?
Right. I was thinking Sam Harris when I said human flourishing instead of eudaimonia.
Can I jump in here real quick?
Go for it.
So what I wanted to ask, because I very much sympathize with a point, Bert, you made just a second ago, which was this, and I agree with a lot of aspects of it. Exactly. Well, no, but seriously though, like, we are looking at human nature as sort of this for common ground in these conversations, and I can always appeal to your constitution, your biology, your desires, all of these things that make you you. It seems to me, which makes for the common ground between us. But I guess what I want to ask Aaron, because I know I would be committed to this. I don't know if it should be called nuance or what have you. Is your view, Aaron, that because we are made in the image of God, that, or would you relate the image of God to these psychology, to this intuitionism? That the reason we have these intuitions is because of a deeper constitution being made,
right,
evolutionarily or not?
Yes, I would say that it's no coincidence that when the Bible says, I think this happens a ton. When the Bible says something like the law of God is written on the hearts of man, that's a very poetic way of describing God made you with a conscience. Like, the law of God being written on your heart, moral rules being obvious to you, is the exact same thing as an evolutionary psychologist saying it's self-evident that there's morality.
Can I offer something here, Jimmy?
Please do, yeah.
The way that I would see this is that the way that I would resolve this is I would say that Aaron and I agree up until the point of like I have I said it before, like a teleonomic account for how why it is the case that we are the creatures that we are. And you have a teleological case, or account that roots your nature in God's creative act, or God's creative act through theistic evolution, or however you want to account for it, and that the resonance of your behavior with that teleology is what constitutes the good for Aaron. But it parallels exactly what I'm referring to, I think, with that distinction. But then the question then becomes, why is that? Because you have this one kind of tier beyond that, which is God, in terms of God's creating us with his nature. Then I think that's where I see the problem, is that the nature of God is not a teleological account, right? Like, God is not suited for something or made for a purpose. And so God requires an account of good that does not, that is separate from all of these things. And that's actually, it goes back to kind of my, why does God need a spaceship? That's my issue, is that then I don't understand what we're referring to anymore, because good and valuing things makes sense on my account of biological organisms here, called Homo sapiens on Earth. But it doesn't make sense to me for God to create them a certain way. I understand the resonance between it, but that could it be another way and still result in the good? I would argue no. And so then I think that creates the problem that Jimmy probably has, which is that the good is not arbitrary, or God's not arbitrarily the way he is. He's necessarily the way he is. But then I think that runs into the Euthyphro dilemma of, is God's commands good because they're good, or does he command them because they're good, or is it good because he commands them, right? Like, I think that becomes the problem. And that's where I actually think that the Euthyphro dilemma has a problem that mine doesn't. That the good, in my case, results is related to the nature of our of how we came to be, and what it means to be a human being, or what it means to be a Homo sapien. And if you're not referring to those things, you're referring to something else.
I really feel like you summed up exactly what the differences and commonalities were there. The only thing I would add to that is, I would just take that Euthyphro dilemma and make it maybe a bit more nuclear. I would say, like, how, does God have these? If we're gonna keep with the virtue ethicist way, does God have these properties because they're maximal, or are they maximal because God has them? Are these God-making properties because they're in God, or does God have them because they're God-making? Right? Any account of fundamentally shared ontology, my problem there is, well, it just seems to,
right,
like you said, it seems.
That's why you have the two tiers, right? Like, that's the interesting thing, I think. Or from my perspective, that's how I see it. Is that you're accounting for it by creating there's a good for God, and then there's a good for us. And I think that does result still. You go back to, why is God good then? Like, whatever we're referring to there, what is that, right? But I understand why you're doing that, because I actually think that the good there's a sense in which good makes sense for biological organisms on Earth who have relations. I think there's a way you can kind of root that in by virtue of the way that they are. This is the way it is.
Exactly.
And I think that for a God, these things don't make sense. If you're going to appeal to another, like a layer beyond that I have a different set of issues with that. But yeah.
I don't think that necessarily the Euthyphro dilemma is here. I think, the Euthyphro dilemma is more referred to, I wouldn't say polytheistic, but Greek gods, essentially. The story about Greek gods, that there are many, that they fight with each other. and things like that. It's not about, I don't think it's necessarily reflect here when God is the more Platonic God in a lot of ways. Like,
Yeah, Socrates was referring to with the Euthyphro was which God are you appealing to when you do these things, because they have conflicting interests. But I think it still has, like, when I refer to the Euthyphro dilemma, I'm kind of taking the purpose, the point of that exercise or that dilemma, and kind of extracting it out kind of in the common form now, which is with the monotheistic God of what gives him the nature that he is, and what could he not have another nature, or is that nature essential or necessary to his being what he is?
I think that what monotheistic theology, at least in the Middle Ages, did, I don't know beforehand, it's take some part of the Euthyphro dilemma. For example, Maimonides take a lot of the philosophical discourse and try to say, this is God, the element that this is the unmoved mover, for example, but this is element in the unmoved mover that is not the same philosophically. And sometimes we would even say that you don't necessarily have justification, I guess. I'm not entirely clear on that, but I think that if you define the problem with Euthyphro that is also that he creates the gods himself. He creates the image of the gods also. He creates stories about them. He judged his dad on stories that he understood, not because of the gods. I think that's another layer in the dialogue itself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that it's really appealing here. I mean, the question of what is good will always remain, if that's what you ask. I think it's a deeper problem on how human can reason about something good, if that's what you ask. What is the good in God? If I understood your question.
Yeah. Yeah, or what makes him? Yeah, what makes him good? Yeah, but we're coming up on 3 hours. I should probably let you go, Aaron. This was a great conversation. I'm going to go back as I always do. I'm going to find that I missed about half the conversation because when I'm just simply listening to something, I can take it in so much better than when I'm in conversation, and
Gotcha.
my brain is trying to remember what it is I want to say. So when it's a passive action and I'm sitting there listening, conversations are wonderful, but I get so much more when I go back and listen to them.
Gotcha. You mind if I take one crack at Euthyphro real quick?
Sure.
Okay. The Euthyphro dilemma would be powerful if it was saying morality or is an arbitrary thing that he makes up. That's the spirit of the Euthyphro dilemma. It wants to put you in two uncomfortable spots. Either God's irrelevant or morality is just made up by him on a whim. But the real Euthyphro dilemma, I think, fails to do that, because the distinction is between this. Is something good because God commands it, or does he command it because it's good? Now, interestingly, Socrates answers his own dilemma. The answer he believes is true is that if God ever commands something, it's because it was already good. Because Socrates, like Plato, believes that there's the form of the good, and that the best a God can do is see it and then tell us what it looks like by commands. So the command is always what Scott called a moral middleman. So what's interesting about the response that I would offer to the Euthyphro dilemma is it's the exact same response Socrates offers, except instead of the good, you just call that God. So you pose the dilemma again. Is it good because God commands it? No. Is it good? Is the command good? Sorry, let me restart. Is it good because God commands it? No. Is it commanded because it is good? Yes. Is that identical to saying it's external to God and God's irrelevant? No, because God is the good. So
yeah,
yes.
I agree with you to a degree up until I say that. What I would say is that the good is whatever God is. The good is existent with God. It is not separate from him. but would be eternally as it is so. So I would say God is, it's not that God's arbitrary. I think God is, it would make it arbitrary, but it is what God is. So it's not a problem, I don't think. It's not that, I think everything, the way that I would have appealed to it as a Christian, where I still a theist, is I would say that everything God creates is in resonance with his nature, and therefore the good that we endeavor to do is in accordance with this God. Could God be another way? Perhaps, but it is it's not that he's a separate standard. He is the standard, or living up to a separate standard, or standard that's apart from him, that's been eternal. It is that he has the standard he has, and he's had it for all eternity, or he has the nature he has, and he's had it for all eternity. Yeah. I think it's fairly similar, but sorry.
Yeah, super similar. I would not argue that that he could change, though. I would say it doesn't even make sense to talk about God as changing.
But I would say it doesn't make sense to refer to it, a God of another name would not be this God, right? Like that's actually how I would say it. I would say like then you're not talking about this God anymore. You're talking about whatever. But
it sounds a lot like it may not be identical. For example, I wouldn't say that the laws or the good exist in eternality with God, but that sounds very similar to my perspective, because the laws are so that the good is created so that it resonates, to use your terminology, with the world. It's the connection between God's good and human goodness is the impetusness of God. God is the impetus. God is the grounds. God is the precondition. He has that absolute good, to which this is just an image or an archetype, or a
oh, is Jimmy still there?
Oh yes, I sorry. That was I didn't.
I think you cut out, and then you ended up. Well, for me, you cut out, and then I think you muted because you were at the end of your sentence, but we didn't catch the very end of it, or I didn't anyway. But I think we got the gist. I think there's still, like, I still have issues with it, but if I was going to bite the bullet anyway, that's how I would bite the bullet, I think. So was there something else you wanted to bring up, Jimmy? You had said that you had to take off, but you wanted one last question.
Oh, well, let me ask this first, because it might open, it may not open a can of worms, but it might take us on a tangent. So is it okay if we have, like, I think it would at least take like 10 minutes to.
I'm good. Are you okay, Aaron?
Cool with me.
Okay, cool. So I just to give a pretext, so the question isn't understood as pointed. I don't mean it to be pointed. I'm completely agnostic with respect to evolutionary biology. And Aaron, like, you have a scientific realist perspective with respect to scientific methodology. Just jump in and say, no, that's not the case.
If by scientific realist you mean I accept all the major theories and think they're accurate, then yes.
Okay. Well, I would say, like, do you think the historical and metaphysical claims, do you interpret models of science as being historical or metaphysical in nature?
I have no idea what that question means.
I didn't either.
Okay, so for example, if I say, like, okay, if I start talking about gravity, right? If I start talking about Newton's model of physics, do you think that actually describes the world as it is, or do you think that that's just a useful analogy that we to predict things, but it isn't necessarily descriptive of the universe?
I think all theories are attempting to describe the universe, that we make a body of observations and then come up with a theory that best describes that body of observations, and that the better the theory, the more accurately it describes the universe. There will be stuff that we miss, and that we may have theories that do not accurately describe the universe, but the goal, and often the result is that we do accurately describe the universe.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so I just want to make sure. So yeah, so I'm not on the same page with the evolution or the way I interpret scientific methodology. But when you guys were talking earlier, when you guys first started talking, and you were talking about Aaron, your sort of discovery that evolutionary biology isn't in with Genesis, which by the way, I wholeheartedly agree with you on. Theistic evolution to me is a completely of Genesis, but in light of those sort of things, where you're talking about coming to these conclusions without an agenda, I'm wondering, okay, how do you reconcile the idea of not having a faith-bidden agenda in light of passages in the scripture which seem to me to tell you to have one, like where Peter says, you know, set apart Christ as Lord of your hearts, or where Paul says, you know, we destroy all strongholds of knowledge risen up against, or we destroy all intellectual strongholds risen up against the knowledge of God, or where Paul says in Colossians, you know, don't be taken by worldly philosophy, all wisdom is contained in Christ. Like, how do you look at these? And how am I supposed to? How would you advise me to interpret you as a fellow Christian, fellow believer, without this Christian bias? Isn't it a good thing to have a Christian agenda when you're looking at things like philosophy? And
I think when you have all the passages you're referencing there about not getting taken up with the worldly philosophies, I think are actually saying, not saying like science is bad or philosophy is bad, but discouraging you from following charlatans or bad philosophy. Like when Thomas is critiqued for doubting, I don't think it's saying doubt is an inherently bad thing. I think it's saying Thomas's doubt is a bad thing. Because if you live with literally the person you believe is God incarnate, and he performs miracles, and he tells you after seeing millions of miracles or however many he's done that he's going to do one more miracle, and now you decide to doubt, that is the epitome of irrational. It goes against all of your experiences. And you have passages in the scripture that say things like, he performed these miracles so that they would have faith. Faith isn't just blindly believing the Christian answer, it's trusting the evidence available to you. So when he gives them faith, he's giving them evidence. That's the same thing there. When you have, I quote at the end of my videos, test everything, hold on to the good. Right? So this concept of faith, I think, in our modern culture has become associated with blindly believing something. But I think the term itself means something more akin to rationally trusting something. Faith would be a terrible thing if you put your faith in something blindly, or if you put your faith in something, or you trusted something that didn't have evidence to backing it up. Trusting a girlfriend who cheats on you regularly is a bad idea. Faith would be bad in that instance. So I think the entire concept of faith only becomes a good thing in Christianity because Christianity happens to be true. And if it was not true, or there was not good evidence for it, then I think faith would be a bad thing.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question, Bert?
Yeah.
And Aaron, if you guys have time.
Sure.
So my follow-up to that would be just to make sure I can clarify this and understand you. So, what about someone who says, yeah, and I'll just be honest here. So someone like myself would say, yeah, I totally think there's evidence. So there's so much evidence in the world that Christianity is self-evident, at least from my perspective. And I think also coterminous with that, or simultaneously, Christ commands people to believe. It's not just a statement of, you know, you should believe this because it's evinced, but you should also believe this because you are morally obligated. You know, I am not only the king of your obedience in affairs about the Sabbath or in loving the orphan, but I'm also the king of your ideas, your thoughts, your beliefs, everything about you. And so when I command you to believe, you're morally obligated. Is it bad for a Christian to come into these other philosophical topics and be willing to look at the evidence, but also be completely unwilling to test whether or not what they believe in concerning Christ's deity or the Trinity or things of that nature? Is it okay on your view to not test those things? Is it okay to not say, you know, I'm hypothetically going to not believe this for a minute and see whether or not it turns out to be true?
I think you must, as the verse says, test everything and hold on to the good. There's another passage, I want to say Galatians, but I'm not positive, where it says the equivalent of this. If Jesus has not risen, then your hope is in vain. As in, if it ain't true, then your faith is worthless. So I think it's an imperative, not just as a Christian, but as a human, to try and figure out what things are true. And if Christianity is true, only then is your faith good.
Okay, cool. I think that answers my question. Yeah.
You have to first determine it's true before you can actually warrant faith in it.
Aaron, there was one more question. There was one more question online when somebody saw this link that I said I would ask you. An atheist asked, if you were not a Christian, would you kill other people?
Gosh, no. Okay, so this is a direct, this is the fault of Christians, by the way. All right, because there's so many Christians that argue like you can't be good without God. That is not the moral argument at all. You can definitely be good without God. And if I did not believe in God, I would not become an evil, terrible person. Yeah. You can be.
I didn't even expect that much of an answer. I just wanted to get a laugh at you. He said, as every Christian fundie believes, or something like that. So he just came right in with the straw man right away.
I will join you with critiquing of the other fundies.
Hey, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a pleasure. I hope. I know this is going to be a painful watch for me at the beginning, but I hope you don't mind it. You didn't mind us grilling you at the end there either. That was
no, that was great. That was quite fun.
And it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks, Jimmy, Hana, and Dash. I almost always call you CRISPR for some reason. You have like similar avatars. But thank you for joining again, Dash. It was a pleasure to have you in, and Noah as well. And thank you to everybody in the external chat. This is a fun one. I need to figure out who my guest is for next week, but I have some ideas. It's just a pleasure talking to you. So thanks for taking the time. So hopefully when I do my my video on morality, you'll chime in the comments, or
of course, looking forward to it.
And I look forward to getting reamed. So take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.